Rivers hide countless secrets in their depths. They conceal the chilling evidence of tragedies and crimes. This is exactly what the residents of a small town witnessed when, on one gloomy day, the waves washed ashore the body of a young teenage girl who literally had no face. Yes, you heard that right. This story took place in the small town of Waurika, located in a remote southern region of Oklahoma, USA. It's a quiet place with a population of about 2,000 people, where everyone knows each other. Life here flows smoothly and unhurriedly. In the fall of 1996, one of the homes in Waurika was occupied by the rich family, Gail the mother, Dwayne the father, and their 4 children, 3 boys and a girl named Heather, who at the time of these events was a sophomore in high school. Heather was not only an excellent student, but also a cheerleader. She had grown into a true beauty and attracted attention wherever she went. The girl had a kind nature, but was quite adventurous when it came to having fun. At 16, Heather was in her rebellious phase and wanted to try everything in life. On the evening of October 2, 1996, an argument arose between Heather and her mother over a $300 phone bill the girl had racked up chatting with her friends. Gail was upset by her daughter's wastefulness, while Dwayne took the situation more calmly. The thing was, the family was going through tough financial times. Heather's father, an electrician, had recently been severely injured in a transformer explosion. The man barely survived and required prolonged treatment and skin grafts. He couldn't work, so his wife had to take on an extra job to keep the family afloat. Every dollar counted, as expensive surgeries lay ahead for the father. The mother tried to explain to Heather that she couldn't afford to pay bills amounting to hundreds of dollars every month and to instill in her daughter respect for money, for elders, and the desire for independence. However, the teenage girl had a hard time accepting these admonitions, which led to a serious quarrel. When tempers cooled, Heather decided to go to bed. She went down to the living room, where she wished her father good night. Passing by her mother, the girl demonstratively remained silent, making it clear that she was still offended. On this sad note, all the family members retired to their rooms. The next morning, October 3rd, Gail, as usual, woke the children up for breakfast. But Heather didn't come out for a long time, and her mother attributed it to teenage resentment. The woman was sure that eventually hunger would force her daughter to come downstairs, despite her rebellious mood. But the girl never showed up. When Gail lost patience and went up to Heather's room, she was surprised to find no one there. Cell phones were not so common back then, so Heather didn't have one. The worried parents called all of their daughter's girlfriends, but none of them knew where she might be. Such behavior was completely unlike Heather. She had no mental issues and had never run away from home before. Moreover, the girl always took great care of her appearance and was unlikely to go anywhere for long without a change of clothes and makeup. But all her things were left at home. Gail and Dwayne wasted no time and headed to the sheriff's office in Waurika to report their daughter missing. The mother told about yesterday's argument with Heather, during which the woman reproached the girl for the huge phone bill and the stubbornness with which she refused to admit her guilt. The parents felt that their daughter's endless chats with her friends were going beyond reason, and although Dwayne was generally calmer, he supported his wife on this matter. The sheriff tried to reassure the worried parents, assuring them that the girl had probably just run away from home, as teenagers often do, especially after a fight with their parents. But Gail and Dwayne knew this was out of character for their daughter. Heather usually didn't run from problems but tried to find a compromise, even after conflicts. Unfortunately, this time the mother's fiery reaction and the girl's lack of restraint, who couldn't admit her mistake, led to an unfortunate situation. Despite the parents' concerns, law enforcement officials assured them that most such situations resolve themselves. Teenagers who have run away from home usually come to their senses quickly and return to their families. It was quite possible that while Gail and Dwayne were at the sheriff's office, their daughter was already back home. The officers tried to reassure the worried mother and father, assuring them that everything would be fine. They explained that for a girl to be declared missing, at least a day must pass without any contact. Since the specified time had not yet elapsed, the police could not accept the statement and sent the couple home to wait for news from Heather. Disappointed by the attitude of law enforcement, Gail and Dwayne felt that something had happened to their daughter and decided to start their own search in town. First of all, they decided to talk to the girl's closest circle and contacted several of her friends. Among them was 17-year-old Randy Wood, the captain of the school football team, whom Heather had previously dated. Although their romantic relationship quickly ended, the young people remained friends. By the way, it was with Randy that the girl had recently run up a huge phone bill. When the mother of the missing girl called the boy, he said he had no idea about Heather's whereabouts or what could have happened to her. Despite his seemingly convincing tone, Gail felt that Randy was hiding something. He seemed to be repeating a rehearsed story, like a robot, and wasn't at all worried about the disappearance of his ex-girlfriend, which seemed suspicious. However, Randy could not be caught in a lie, so Heather's mother decided to contact another friend of her daughter, another 17-year-old high school student named Josh Bagwell, whom she had recently started dating. When the woman called Josh, his grandmother picked up the phone. She said that the boy was resting after a party and she didn't want to wake him up. The elderly woman categorically refused to call her grandson to the phone and admitted that she was just cleaning up the trailer in the yard where the schoolchildren had been partying the night before. When Gail asked about Heather, the grandmother replied that she hadn't seen the girl. Having received no useful information, the worried parents drove all over the county in search of at least some clues about their daughter's whereabouts. A day passed, but all efforts were in vain, so Gail and Dwayne went to the police station again. This time, law enforcement finally joined the search operation. A week passed, but no valuable information about the missing schoolgirl appeared. Given the time frame, hope of finding the girl alive was fading with each passing day. Later, while examining the outskirts on the border with Texas, police patrols noticed a body in the river, floating face down. It was half submerged in the muddy water, but people on the bridge noticed it. The skin of the unknown victim was covered with a thick layer of dirt, as if intentionally to make the body harder to see. When divers managed to pull the gruesome find ashore, something much more terrifying was revealed under the layer of mud. The mutilated victim had numerous traces of buckshot, indicating a point-blank shooting, probably from a shotgun. The face was so disfigured that it seemed impossible to identify the deceased at first glance. A forensic examination was needed. As a result of the investigation, experts established that the victim had been shot 9 times from close range, once in the back of the head and 8 times in the back. The body was literally torn to pieces and was in a terrible condition. Since only one person was listed as missing in the area at that time, Heather Rich's parents were called in for identification. They were able to identify their daughter only by the engraved name ring given to the girl by her mother. This dispelled any doubts. It was Heather lying on the morgue table. The identity of the deceased was finally confirmed by dental records, as forensic experts found non-removable braces in the oral cavity of the mutilated body, which the schoolgirl wore to correct her bite. The news of the young cheerleader's death spread like wildfire through the town and became the main topic of discussion the very next day. Within a few hours, all the local residents knew about the tragedy. Football player Randy Wood also found out about it, for whom the day when it all happened coincided with the annual match where he had been recognized as the king of the game for several seasons in a row. Usually, after such competitions, loud celebrations were held. But this time there was no room for fun. The boy was shocked by the terrible news about his ex-girlfriend and later went to the same bridge where the body was found. He stared into the murky waters for a long time, hiding a terrible secret from everyone. In fact, Randy knew much more than he told the parents of the deceased, and soon the investigation led the police to the boy and several of his friends. These events resembled the plot of a terrifying Hollywood horror movie. In the very heart of a small town in Oklahoma, 3 teenagers turned an ordinary evening into a bloody massacre. One of them was from a wealthy family, the second was a star of school football and the team captain, and the third was a novice street hooligan. As soon as the detectives took up the investigation, they first spoke with Heather's parents. By that time, Gail had already managed to call quite a few of her daughter's friends and acquaintances. Her suspicions fell on 2 young men, Heather's ex-boyfriend, 17-year-old Randy Wood, and her current boyfriend Josh Bagwell, who had arrived from a party and didn't even bother to call. The woman was convinced that the boys were hiding something. It seemed that the high school students were telling the same rehearsed story, with even the wording of sentences coinciding in places. However, they could not give a clear answer to additional questions, which seemed extremely strange. Noticeably nervous, the teenagers were reluctant to make contact, unlike Heather's other friends who actively joined in her search. Gail intuitively felt that Randy and Josh knew much more than they were saying in their telephone excuses. Talking to classmates and other friends of the deceased, investigators received several leads indicating that Josh and Randy had information about the events of that fateful night when the girl ran away from home after an argument with her mother. Later, it turned out that Heather had indeed intended to go to a party to meet her boyfriend Josh. Despite her parents' ban on leaving the house late in the evening, this did not stop the rebellious schoolgirl. After waiting for Gail and Dwayne to fall asleep, she jumped out the window around 11 p.m. There, those same two suspicious young men, well known in the city and popular among local youth, were supposed to be waiting for her. Josh was considered a rich heir to wealthy parents. He always drove the coolest cars and wore the most stylish clothes, willingly demonstrating his family's wealth. This boy was a typical representative of the golden youth, who cared only about his own popularity and money. In contrast, Randy Wood came from a simple family, but thanks to his talent and perseverance in sports, he gained no less fame than his wealthy friend. Friends adored the handsome team captain for his virtuoso play on the field. For his merits, he became the best football player not only in the school but in the whole city, and even gained popularity among school teams at the state level. Randy and Josh were inseparable and usually spent their weekends driving around in Josh's car on dirt roads. Of course, girls could often be seen in their company. The boys regularly drank alcohol and sometimes smoked marijuana. Due to the lack of entertainment facilities for young people in the town, the teenagers simply had nothing to do, so they improvised as best they could. It is known that Heather Rich often spent time with this company. A friend said that the girl had also tried weed and alcohol with them, and on the night before her disappearance, she ran away to hang out with the popular boys. This news shocked the parents of the 16-year-old straighter student who had taken such a slippery path. Although the couple was aware of their daughter's propensity for risky experiments, they had no idea that this was happening in the company of young men. As it turned out, 5 days before the disappearance, on September 27, 1996, Heather herself and another girl from the support group were caught in a corner of the stadium. Marijuana and smoking paraphernalia were found on them. It also became known about alcohol consumption. Because of this incident, the schoolgirls were suspended from classes for 3 days. The teachers informed Gail and Dwayne about everything, and they did not hide their indignation, as they never expected their 16-year-old daughter to get involved in such dangerous experiments. Heather admitted that she tried the prohibited substances out of curiosity and promised to stop. However, the parents were more concerned about something else: why a diligent student and athlete had taken this wrong path at all. The young girl's attraction to alcohol and drugs was frightening. Despite their daughter's assurances that she would give up her bad habits, Gail and Dwayne were never able to verify her sincerity. Instead, these harmful passions probably had a direct relation to her death. The detectives decided to talk to Josh and Randy, with whom the murdered schoolgirl was last seen. They hoped to find out the details of the party that preceded Heather's disappearance. The captain of the football team admitted that he and his friend were in a trailer behind Josh's house, playing dominoes and drinking all evening. However, both boys denied any contact with Heather that ill-fated evening. Interestingly, the police noticed the same details that had alarmed the mother of the deceased. Both young men told exactly the same story, as if reciting a memorized text, and spoke mechanically, like robots. Moreover, they showed practically no emotion, even though it was about the death of their mutual friend. Such behavior convinced law enforcement officers that the teenagers were lying. They suspected that the murder could have happened out of jealousy when the young men couldn't share the girl between them. Of course, at that point, the investigators did not yet have strong evidence that would directly link the high school students to the crime. However, the strange behavior of Randy and Josh reinforced the police's doubts about their possible involvement. Both ended up as the main suspects, so it was necessary to study their biographies, relationships with Heather, and the circumstances of the party that took place on the eve of her disappearance more carefully. The autopsy results provided new food for thought. First of all, attention was drawn to the number of shots, as many as 9. Even police shotguns usually hold 8 rounds in the magazine. Why would someone reload the weapon to fire an additional shot when the victim was obviously already dead? Another interesting detail was the type of ammunition used, the so-called double buckshot. These powerful cartridges have excessive lethal force for executing a 16-year-old girl. Fortunately, such a specific choice by the criminal helped the investigation make its first serious breakthrough. These rare rounds were sold in only one store in the city. After checking the receipts, the police found out that only one person had purchased them shortly before the murder. The seller recognized in the photo the very suspected young man, high school student Josh Bagwell, who had come to the store and bought a whole box, that is, 20 rounds. According to the store employee, another young man was with Josh, but not his best friend Randy, but a certain Curtis Gamble, a guy well known to the local police. As it turned out, Curtis was the oldest among those involved in the case. He was already 19. Despite his young age, he had already been arrested several times and had spent most of his conscious life in juvenile detention centers. This guy was completely inadequate and had repeatedly come to the attention of law enforcement. He was caught drunk driving, shooting his gun at dogs, horses, or even random passers-by. Therefore, Curtis himself fell under the greatest suspicion, unlike the other two young men who, although they behaved strangely, had never had problems with the law before and had never been considered aggressive or dangerous. On October 23rd, the police visited the home of the juvenile offender in a neighboring town where he lived. But even more important was the fact that just a few kilometers from his home was the same bridge under which the fishermen stumbled upon the mutilated body. Curtis himself was not found at home, but the law enforcement officers spoke with his grandmother. The woman told about her grandson and, among other things, mentioned that he knew the area well and often visited the bridge in question. Curtis had loved to fish there since he was a kid, and the elderly woman had taken him with her more than once. So it turned out that the boy had a much closer connection with the crime scene than the police could have assumed before talking to his grandmother. The next day, the detectives managed to meet with Curtis himself. The young man was detained and taken to the sheriff's office in Waurika. The interrogation lasted more than 8 hours, but the suspect essentially did not say anything, although he agreed to take a polygraph test. But even this did not become the main find of the investigators. Curtis's most valuable confession concerned his possession of a rather rare type of firearm, a Mossberg shotgun, a special feature of which is a magazine for 9 rounds. Thus, the detectives suggested that they had stumbled upon the owner of the likely murder weapon, as Heather had been shot with that very type of gun. When the weapon was seized and a ballistic examination was assigned, experts officially confirmed that the schoolgirl had been shot with Curtis's shotgun. After being presented with evidence of his involvement in the murder of the young cheerleader, the boy gave in. He told the police that he had dragged 2 of his friends, Randy and Josh, into this crime, after which he wrote a detailed 2-page confession. 3 weeks after Heather's death, law enforcement finally had a suspect who had confessed to the crime. Given the likely complicity of the other young men, Randy and Josh were also arrested and brought to the station. The schoolboys were shown Curtis's testimony, where he claimed that he himself had initiated the massacre of the girl, but Randy had become the direct perpetrator. According to the confessor, he had given his shotgun to his friend and ordered him to shoot the innocent victim, while Josh had simply been present. However, the police were skeptical about this testimony, since the football team captain did not fit the image of a typical criminal. In the past, the young man had never had any problems with the law, had been an exemplary student and a successful athlete, popular among his peers. No one had ever spoken badly of him. Considering the geography of the events, the party took place in southern Oklahoma, and the body was found in Texas. The boys faced trial in this particular state, where the death penalty is prescribed for murder. This became a key problem for the investigation, as under local laws, the actual perpetrator could end up in the dock. Therefore, none of the suspects wanted to take the blame for the fatal shot. Only after persistent attempts by the police and a second meeting with the investigators did Randy finally begin to testify. However, he categorically denied his direct participation in the murder, claiming that Curtis had been the shooter and the initiator of the massacre of Heather, and Josh had simply helped him. For his part, Josh refused to cooperate with law enforcement. Thus, in October 1996, the detectives received 2 confessions that contradicted each other in many aspects. In the end, the investigators concluded that Randy's testimony seemed more truthful, and he had also successfully passed a lie detector test. It became clear that it would hardly be possible to establish the exact sequence of events on the fateful evening of October 2nd with 100% certainty, but it was decided to rely on the information provided by the football team captain. According to his confessions, that day Randy had planned to drink with his friends Curtis and Josh. When they gathered, it turned out that Heather was supposed to join them. The girl knew Josh and Randy himself well, but had never met Curtis before, so she had no idea how dangerous a guy he was. When all 4 of them got together and had a good drink, Heather, like the rest of the company, found herself on the verge of losing consciousness. It was at this moment that Curtis, drunk, got the idea to take advantage of the girl's helpless state and abuse her. He immediately proceeded to act. As Randy recounted, Heather woke up from the harassment and screamed, pushing the attacker away, and then fainted again. Despite the fact that she could barely move her tongue, Curtis got scared because even a half-drunk victim could remember everything when she sobered up. He knew very well that rapes are met with an unfriendly reception in prison, and he did not want to end up behind bars because of this incident. Therefore, he suggested simply getting rid of the girl. The younger boys initially took these words as a bad joke, but Curtis was not joking. He really took a shotgun out of the trunk of his car and pointed it at the three teenagers. Randy and Josh realized that they were dealing with an extremely unpredictable guy, so they decided not to argue. They loaded the helpless schoolgirl into the trunk of Josh's car, and the whole company headed towards Curtis's house. But a few kilometers from the destination, the older boy ordered them to turn to the bridge where the victim's body was later found. Curtis forced his friends to stop in the middle of the bridge, get Heather out of the trunk, and put her by the railing. Fearing for their own lives, Randy and Josh obeyed. When the unconscious girl was pulled out of the car, she could not stand on her feet. The young men laid her on the ground and sat down in the car, not imagining what would happen next. Curtis walked right up to the helpless Heather and began to shoot her. Randy saw with his own eyes how a huge hole formed in his classmate's skull. He could not stand the gruesome sight, covered his face with his hands, and was afraid to even look in that direction. The attacker emptied the entire magazine of the shotgun into the victim, after which he and Josh threw the girl's mutilated body off the bridge. Getting into the car, the boys fled the crime scene. They saw with their own eyes what Curtis had done to Heather, so fear for their own lives made them keep silent. In October 1996, the three young men were officially charged with the abduction and murder of 16-year-old Heather Rich. The investigators had the hardest time working with Josh Bagwell, who refused to testify and against whom, in fact, there was no direct evidence of involvement. The prosecution had to rely solely on the words of the other two defendants in the case, which contradicted each other. Due to the lack of physical evidence, the evidence base was not very reliable. To remedy this situation, the prosecutor offered Randy Wood a deal with the investigation. In exchange for testimony against Josh, the young man was promised life imprisonment with the right to parole after 30 years. Randy immediately agreed. The prosecutor's office also discussed with Heather's parents the possibility of a similar sentence for Curtis. In the opinion of the victim's family, the most important thing was to get truthful testimony from him, and not to send the underage organizer of the murder to the death penalty. The Rich family first and foremost wanted to know the truth. On October 15th, Curtis accepted the prosecution's offer and pleaded guilty in exchange for life imprisonment without the right to early release. At the same time, during the trial, he continued to behave defiantly and inadequately. While in custody awaiting trial, Curtis once attacked a guard, knocked him down, and began to strangle him. The enraged prisoner was subdued only by the joint efforts of several police officers. In February 1998, almost a year and a half after Heather's tragic death, the trial of Josh Bagwell began. The case had gained such notoriety that there were so many people eager to attend the hearing. In the end, access to the courtroom was restricted, with both random spectators and members of the press barred from being present. The defenders of the accused resorted to various attempts to justify their clients. In fact, the lawyers tried to tarnish the reputation of Heather herself, portraying her as an alcoholic and a loose woman who had allegedly entered into an intimate relationship with Curtis herself and then began to threaten him with exposure, forcing the boy to resort to drastic measures. The parents had to defend the honor and dignity of their daughter. In reality, the girl was a diligent student, a talented athlete, and an extremely decent person who simply found herself in the wrong company and encountered a real criminal. The floor was given to Curtis. To the surprise of those present, he suddenly returned to his initial version of events, claiming that Josh had not participated in the crime at all and had not even been aware of the murder plans. Instead, according to Curtis, it was Randy who had fired the fatal shot. This testimony deeply affected Randy. Unexpectedly for everyone, the football team captain took a desperate step. He refused the plea bargain. The young man did not want his confession to be regarded as dictated solely by the desire to save his own skin. Accusing his accomplices right in the courtroom, Randy stated that he primarily wanted to achieve justice for the innocently murdered girl. This decision went against even the advice of the defendant's lawyer. Despite all the nobility of this act, Randy consciously risked ending up on death row. It was this selfless behavior of the young man that made a strong impression on Heather's parents. The couple even personally met with Randy after the court session. Such a bold and principled step was of great importance to the family of the deceased. On February 10th, Wood appeared before the jury and told the whole truth about the terrible events of that fateful evening. His testimony left no doubt. The young man described in detail the full participation of Josh and Curtis in the murder of Heather, as well as Bagwell's role in concealing the traces of the crime. On February 14th, Curtis Gamble was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and the intentional commission of this particularly serious crime. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with an additional term of 99 years. In May 1998, a meeting took place between Heather's parents and Randy as part of a live television talk show. Despite all the pain and sorrow of losing their daughter, the rich couple expressed sincere admiration for the honesty and deep remorse of this young man. On August 7, 1998, the trial of Randy Wood was concluded. He was also found guilty of involvement in the murder. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 40 years. This decision saddened many people because Wood was the only one of the 3 defendants in the case who sincerely repented of what he had done and, risking his own life, decided to bring the truth to the jury. The prevailing opinion in society was that the boy did not deserve such a severe punishment. Josh Bagwell also suffered the fate of life imprisonment without the right to early release. He was sent to serve his sentence in the same correctional facility as Curtis. In January 2002, both convicts made a daring escape attempt, taking advantage of the night. They managed to hide in the state of Texas for 10 days. A nationwide search was announced. Eventually, the fugitives were caught and returned behind bars to continue serving their life sentences. What you're about to hear will make you shudder. Imagine police officers weeping in horror at what they've seen. Imagine a family where members die one after another under mysterious circumstances. No, this isn't the plot of a mystical thriller. This is a real story that happened to an incredibly charming girl. Daisy Coleman, a young beauty, seemed to have everything one could dream of: a kind heart, a sharp mind, and numerous talents. However, behind the appearance of this charming girl hid a tormented soul that had to endure terrible events at an early age. Daisy was born in the small town of Albany, Missouri, on March 30, 1997. Her father, Michael, worked as a doctor, and her mother, Melinda, was a veterinarian. Daisy was raised in the Coleman family along with her 3 biological brothers, being the second child. Tragedy struck the family in 2009 when Michael, Daisy, and one of her younger brothers were traveling to a neighboring town for a wrestling competition. During this trip, their car collided with an obstacle on the road and flew into a ditch. Sadly, as a result of this terrible accident, the head of the family died. After losing her father, the Coleman family moved to the larger city of Maryville, also in Missouri. Melinda single-handedly raised her 3 sons and daughter, and although it wasn't easy, she managed her responsibilities. At that time, no one in the Coleman family, who had already experienced a horrific loss, could even imagine the curse that awaited them in the future. Early in the morning of January 8, 2012, 14-year-old Daisy Coleman regained consciousness in the yard of her own house. Outside, there was a bone-chilling cold, with temperatures reaching 0. Daisy was lying on the snow, her hair frozen to the ground. The girl was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. At that moment, the first thought that flashed through Daisy's mind was, "I must be dead." She couldn't get up or call for help. Her speech was slurred and confused. Daisy was crying. With great difficulty, the girl managed to crawl to the front door of the house and bang on it with all her might. The clock showed 5 and it was a real miracle that Daisy's mother, Melinda, who was sleeping in her room, heard a strange knocking at the door through her sleep. At first, she thought it was their dogs that had gotten cold outside and were trying to get into the house. The woman threw on a robe and headed for the front door to let the animals into the warm home. When Melinda opened the door, she saw her daughter Daisy on the threshold. The girl was lying on the cold steps, almost unconscious. She reeked heavily of alcohol, unable to speak, only crying. The mother instantly screamed, calling for her sons to help. The boys woke up, quickly ran downstairs, and carried the frozen Daisy into the house. The whole family was terrified. At first, they tried to warm the girl with blankets, but the mother, upon closely examining her daughter, realized that her legs were most likely severely frostbitten. So the mother filled the bathtub with water and asked her sons to take Daisy to the bathroom, leave her there, and go out. The girl was still unconscious. The mother herself began to undress her daughter and saw huge bruises and red marks on her legs. It was only at this moment that the woman realized something terrible had happened to her beloved Daisy. The mother gently immersed Daisy in a bathtub with cool water. As a veterinarian, she knew well how to provide first aid for frostbite. The woman gradually increased the water temperature in the bathtub, thus slowly warming her daughter's body. Fortunately, she managed to help Daisy. Soon the girl warmed up, but her speech remained unclear and confused. It was difficult for Daisy to speak, so the alarmed Melinda called 911 and summoned the police. When the police officers arrived at the scene, they immediately began examining Daisy. However, the girl was still under the influence of alcohol, and her mind was clouded, so she couldn't clearly recount the events of the previous night. Under these circumstances, the police had to turn to Daisy's friend, Paige, who was also at the Coleman family's house that night and slept in the same room as Daisy. Paige shared her version of the events with the officers. As her friend recounted, on Saturday, January 7, 2012, Daisy invited her best friend Paige to her house for a sleepover. In the evening, the girls decided to watch a few horror movies and, for a greater effect, drank strong alcoholic beverages that they had secretly stolen from the Coleman family's home bar. Closer to midnight, Daisy began exchanging messages with her older brother's friend, 17-year-old Matthew Barnett, who was the star of the school football team. Upon learning that Daisy was spending the night with a friend, Matthew sent the girls a message proposing they have fun at his place. Daisy and Paige enthusiastically agreed to this adventure and arranged to meet with Matthew and his friends. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, the girlfriends snuck out of Daisy's house through her bedroom window and ran around the corner, where Matthew and 4 of his friends were already waiting for them. The boys escorted the girls to Matthew's house, helped them get through the window into the basement, and asked them to be quiet so as not to wake up Barnett's parents, who were sleeping upstairs. According to Paige, as soon as she and Daisy found themselves in the basement, Matthew immediately began treating Daisy to alcohol. Paige sat nearby and watched as her friend drank one glass after another, almost without stopping. At some point, one of the boys, named Nicholas, approached Paige, took her hand, and led her to a neighboring empty room in the basement. There, at the young man's initiative, they had sexual intercourse. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daisy went to another room where there was a large bed. Several times, when the door opened, Paige was able to see what was happening in that room with Daisy. The girl was lying on the bed, barely conscious, unable to speak or move. Matthew took advantage of her helpless state and engaged in sexual intercourse with Daisy. His friend Jordan Zetch filmed everything that was happening on his smartphone camera. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the boys decided it was time to go home. They put the girls in the car and drove them to the Coleman family's house. Paige got out of the car first. Matthew told her that Daisy should sit outside in the fresh air to sober up. The boys assured that they would stay with Daisy and take care of her safety outside. They advised Paige to go home and go to bed. The friend believed their words and agreed to go alone. Paige got to the house, climbed through the window into Daisy's bedroom, fell on the bed, and instantly fell asleep. At this time, the boys pulled Daisy out of the car, set her on her feet, and supported her so she wouldn't fall. The girl got sick, so they took off her shoes, took her purse and cell phone, and held her hair while she vomited. Then they gently laid Daisy on the cold ground near the house. Fearing that they might be noticed and not wanting to take risks, the young men quickly got into the car and drove away. Daisy lay outside for about 3 hours in the bitter cold at 0 temperature. She was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants, without socks or shoes. Her hair was wet and frozen. Arriving at the scene on a call, the police officers thoroughly examined the Coleman family's house and the surrounding area. In Daisy's room, they came across 5 empty plastic bottles of alcoholic beverages. In the yard, they found Daisy's bag, her cell phone, shoes, and traces of vomit. That same morning, the victim was taken to the hospital for a medical examination. During the examination, numerous bruises on her legs and tears in the groin area were recorded on Daisy's body. The girl had several tests taken, one of which showed that the alcohol level in her blood was almost twice the maximum allowable limit. After a few hours in the hospital, Daisy finally regained consciousness. She reported that she did not remember any details of the previous night. The girl could not reproduce the details of what happened and admitted that she had drunk too much alcohol. However, Daisy did not deny the fact that she had taken alcoholic beverages from the home bar without her mother's permission and secretly ran away at night to the company of boys. Around 11 a.m. on January 8th, a few hours after the incident, law enforcement officers located Matthew Barnett, Jordan Zetch, and Nicholas Graumaudis. They were charged and all 3 were taken to the police station for interrogation. During questioning, Matthew Barnett did not deny having intimate relations with Daisy Coleman that night. However, he insisted that everything happened by mutual consent. The boy said that when he met Daisy and her friend Paige, the girls were already intoxicated. At first, Matthew denied treating Daisy to alcohol, but the more he spoke, the more entangled he became in his own testimony. Eventually, he did confess to treating Daisy to a few shots of strong drinks to melt her icy heart. Matthew reported that during intercourse, he used a condom, which he threw away on the way back to Daisy's house. Another person involved in the case, Jordan Zech, initially refused to testify but later admitted to using his friend Nicholas' smartphone to record a video of Matthew kissing Daisy. The video lasted about 10 seconds. Jordan managed to show this video to his friends, but then, getting scared, deleted it. Nicholas, who had sexual intercourse with Daisy's friend Paige, was the only one who immediately fully admitted his guilt. He was sent to a juvenile detention center. Matthew's friend, who drove the boys and girls in his car to Daisy's house, said that throughout the ride, Daisy wouldn't stop crying, and Matthew expressed fears that the girl's brother Charlie would kill him if he found out what happened. At the same time, it became known that a few days before the terrible incident, Matthew had already visited the Colemans' home. That time, he had a peaceful dinner with the family at the same table in a friendly atmosphere. At 1 p.m. on January 8th, a search was conducted in the basement of Matthew Barnett's house. Police officers seized bed linen, several empty bottles, men's underwear, and plastic cups. During repeated interrogations, the sheriff's assistant, while talking to Matthew, was moved by the young man's story. At one point, the officer even suggested that girls often resort to such actions to attract attention, and it is quite possible that this case is one of those. The sheriff's assistant praised Matthew for taking care of the girl and driving her home. However, for some reason, the fact that the boy left Daisy alone to freeze on the street did not attract the officer's proper attention. Several days passed, and Daisy Coleman's health condition completely normalized. Her life was no longer in danger. However, the girl still could not recall any new details of that terrible night. 2 months later, in March 2012, all charges against Matthew Barnett and Jordan Zech were completely dropped. The district attorney concluded that the intimate relationship between the young people occurred by mutual consent. The video recording that Jordan made that night could not be restored after deletion, although several of Jordan's classmates claimed they saw footage of Matthew kissing Daisy. During the analysis of the couple's smartphones, the investigation found out that Matthew and Daisy maintained telephone communication about once a month. In text messages, Daisy hinted to Matthew that she was ready to have sexual intercourse with him in exchange for a bottle of strong alcohol. In addition, correspondence was found dating back to before January 8th, in which Daisy and Matthew exchanged explicit messages of a sexual nature. After Matthew's release from custody, it became known that he was the grandson of an influential political figure, Rex Barnett, who had previously been a member of the state legislative assembly. Rex Barnett was a member of the Committee on Criminal Law and Public Safety. He had close ties with many prosecutors and police officers throughout the state of Missouri. Matthew and Jordan were released, and the boys returned to their normal lives. At the same time, Daisy Coleman hoped that the hype surrounding her nightly adventure would finally subside. The girl continued her education, but instead of support from her peers, she faced open hostility and ridicule. Most of her acquaintances sided with Matthew, and Daisy began to be called a liar and a slut. She instantly turned into an outcast, withdrew into herself, and tried to spend as much time as possible at home alone. Daisy, who had previously led an active social and public life, was involved in sports and dancing, now simply disappeared from sight. Moreover, the girl was forced to leave the school cheerleading squad. Daisy's mother, Melinda, began receiving anonymous threats daily, both at home and at work. Soon, the woman was asked to quit her job at the veterinary clinic, where she had worked for many years. After that, the Coleman family realized that they could no longer stay in the town of Maryville and decided to move to another place. In the spring of 2013, their empty house in Maryville, put up for sale, burned to the ground. The police never managed to establish the cause of the fire. There were rumors that Matthew Barnett's father was involved. Sometime later, under extremely mysterious circumstances, the house of Daisy's friend named Paige also burned down. By that time, the girls had already stopped communicating. By the way, Paige also became an outcast at school. It is known that the girl suffered from nightmares for a long time. As time passed, Daisy's story attracted the attention of the media. The girl began receiving active support from people across the country, especially those who had experienced similar traumatic experiences. Thanks to this, Daisy managed to reopen the case against her main offender, Matthew Barnett. The case went to trial, but the boy was found guilty only of leaving Daisy alone in the cold in the middle of the night. Matthew Barnett was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay the Coleman family $2,800 in compensation. The other defendants in the case avoided any charges. Daisy Coleman continued to live her life, but regularly encountered not only words of support, but also threats from anonymous users on the internet. She understood how unfairly people behaved. Daisy took every negative message addressed to her very painfully. In 2016, when 19-year-old Daisy was studying in college, a documentary film titled Audrey and Daisy was released on the Netflix streaming service. The film told the story of violence, bullying, harassment on social networks, and the detrimental consequences this can lead to in the future. Daisy became one of the main characters of the film and shared her story. However, the fate of the second heroine, Audrey Pott from California, turned out to be even more tragic. Almost the same thing happened to Audrey as to Daisy Coleman in 2012. But unlike Daisy, Audrey was unable to cope morally with what happened. The girl's photos quickly spread across the network. Both Audrey's friends and enemies saw them. The last post she left on her social media page contained the following words: "My life is ruined. The whole school knows. I will never get rid of this reputation. Everyone knows how bad I am. I want it all to end." 9 days later, Audrey took her own life. She could not withstand the humiliation that fell upon her from all sides. Audrey's parents were able to initiate a criminal case only 6 months after their daughter's death. The perpetrators, 3 boys, were sentenced to terms ranging from 30 to 45 days. Later, their families paid Audrey's parents about $1 million in moral compensation. Let's return to Daisy Coleman. In 2018, seeking to start life with a clean slate, the girl moved to the state of Colorado, where she got a job at a tattoo parlor. At the same time, she worked on creating a second film project, which focused on the process of her own recovery. However, in June 2018, Daisy faced another shock. Her mother Melinda and brother Tristan got into a car accident while driving to Daisy from their hometown. As a result of the accident, 19-year-old Tristan died. The circumstances of this tragedy remain unknown to this day. After losing her brother, Daisy published a post on social media in which she admitted that every day it became more and more difficult for her to keep her inner demons under control, to put on a smile, and to pretend that everything was fine. After Tristan's death, Daisy co-founded a charitable organization that supported victims of violence. She continued to share her personal tragedy and provide support to other people who found themselves in similar situations. In her publications, Daisy repeatedly talked about how sometimes it was difficult for her to cope with the thoughts swirling in her head. She struggled with emotional pain, panic attacks, and constant terrible memories. In the summer of 2020, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman began sharing disturbing details with her friends. She was being stalked by an unknown man who constantly sent her threats. The girl went to the police and filed a statement that a stranger had been following her since December 2019. Daisy desperately pleaded for help, but her pleas went unanswered. On Tuesday, August 4, 2020, she published a tweet in which she admitted that she was afraid to leave the house. Daisy wrote that she couldn't even walk her dog or go to work because of the overwhelming fear. She also reported that she had lost her appetite and couldn't sleep. A few hours later, a new post from Daisy appeared on Facebook. She said that some man had approached her house and knocked on the door. The girl confessed that she was very scared. She suggested that this man might have previously stolen her keys, and now it would not be difficult for him to get into her home. In addition, Daisy reported that the unknown man had stolen her photos and registered on one of the sites, where he offered intimate services for money on her behalf. Melinda, Daisy's mother, upon stumbling upon her daughter's message on social media, immediately called the Colorado police asking them to check on the girl. At 4 p.m., officers arrived at Daisy's home. She let them into the house, and the police spent about an hour with her. The girl again told them about being stalked by an unknown man. The officers did not notice anything suspicious in Daisy's behavior. But shortly after the law enforcement officers left, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman contacted her boyfriend via video call. During the conversation, she suddenly took out a gun, pointed it at herself, and pulled the trigger. Her boyfriend did not immediately realize what had happened. The connection was cut off. Daisy stopped answering calls. Frightened, the young man dialed 911. When the police officers arrived at Daisy Coleman's house again at 8 p.m., they found the girl already dead. One of the police officers couldn't hold back and burst into tears at the sight. The girl had a fatal gunshot wound. She was lying in a pool of blood. Melinda, Daisy's mother, reported her daughter's death in a post on her social media page. She wrote, "Daisy was my best friend and a wonderful daughter. How I wish I could take her pain away. She never recovered from what those boys did to her back in school. It's just not fair. "My girl is gone from us." The woman said that she had fought for Daisy and her mental health for many years. She believed that she had done everything possible for her beloved daughter. The mother also confirmed that in recent months, Daisy was indeed being stalked, and just recently, the girl found out that she would never be able to have children. After Daisy's death, the tattoo parlor where she worked was robbed. The perpetrator stole an album with Daisy's exclusive sketches and her tattoo machine. 4 months passed. In December 2020, 58-year-old Melinda Coleman published another heartfelt post on social media dedicated to her beloved daughter. And soon after, the woman took a gun in her hands and did the same as Daisy. Only 2 sons remained in the Coleman family, the older Charlie and the younger Logan. The charitable organization founded by Daisy organized a fundraiser to support the boys. It became known that Matthew Barnett's life and career were going well. After the death of Daisy and her mother Melinda, he expressed words of sympathy about the tragedy that befell the Coleman family. Do you know that every 2 minutes in the USA, a woman dies from violence? Now you are looking at a photo of a real psychopath who heartlessly took the lives of 2 wonderful women. Christine Melton was killed in her sleep. He simply strangled her with his bare hands and tried to dispose of her body like trash. Diana Ruiz, a mother of 2, was brutally crushed by a car, turning her into a bloody pulp. And he did it with pleasure, boasting about the details of his atrocities. Christine Melton was a beauty with blonde hair, a bright smile, and a kind heart. At 35, she radiated the joy of life and shared it generously with everyone around her. Born in Illinois, Christine had shown a bright creative nature from an early age. She was passionate about painting, dancing, singing, and dreamed of becoming a famous actress someday. However, it was not a star-studded career, but the simple earthly joys that became the meaning of her life. In school, she befriended Stephanie, with whom she carried her friendship through the years. The girls shared common dreams and aspirations to find their happiness. In search of a better fate, they moved together to sunny Cape Coral in Florida, where they got jobs as waitresses at Duffy's Bar. Christine adored her job, as it allowed her to communicate with people daily and share the warmth of her heart. Relatives remember Christine as a true ray of sunshine that warmed everyone around her. She was a loving daughter, sister, friend, and was called the favorite aunt for her nephews, whom Christine paid a lot of attention to. This girl genuinely cared for her close ones and was always ready to help. No wonder she was considered the glue that held her large family together. Christine had numerous talents and hobbies. She painted beautifully, creating picturesque landscapes that adorned her friends' homes. Christine also loved to travel, especially to the mountains and beaches. This passion for travel attracted her to new places and adventures. Even in ordinary days, Christine found a reason for laughter and fun, as she had a crazy sense of humor. Her jokes were always apt and witty, which made her beloved in companies. But Christine's greatest treasure was her loyalty and ability to love sincerely. In all her relationships, friendly or romantic, she gave herself completely. She was a reliable friend who cherished friendships for years. Christine also dreamed of meeting her true love, getting married, and building a strong family. Her heart was full of tenderness and compassion for everyone around. Christine became passionate about aesthetics and dreamed of opening her own beauty salon. She attended courses in makeup and manicure, perfecting her skills. In her free time, Christine loved to experiment with her appearance, trying bold looks. Despite her love for fun, deep down, Christine remained a quiet and modest girl. She did not seek to be the center of attention and felt comfortable in a friendly circle. Christine valued trustful conversations and was genuinely interested in people's lives. This combination of external attractiveness, inner beauty, and bright energy attracted people to her. 43-year-old Diana Ruiz was the embodiment of maternal love, care, and devotion to her family. This slender woman with long dark hair and a gentle smile dedicated her life to her 2 most precious people, her teenage daughter and 5-year-old son. They were the meaning of her existence, for whom Diana spared no effort, time, or emotional warmth. Diana was born and raised in Cape Coral in a friendly Cuban family. From an early age, she was surrounded by her parents' love, who instilled in her the values of cohesion, mutual assistance, and the joy of communication. The girl grew up active and sociable, easily made friends, and was the soul of companies. At the same time, Diana showed considerable responsibility and determination, dreaming of a worthy education and profession. Fate granted Diana true feminine happiness, 2 wonderful children, and a loving husband. Her daughter inherited her mother's beauty and gentle nature, while her son her zest for life and spontaneity. Diana was proud of her little ones above all and made every effort to raise them as worthy people. She supported them in all their endeavors, rejoiced at every success, and consoled them in troubles. For her daughter, Diana was the best friend and advisor, and for her son, the most caring and wisest mom in the world. To ensure a decent future for her children, Diana worked hard. For the last 5 years, she was a constant bartender at the local Moose Lodge Club, which became her second home. She adored her job because it allowed her to communicate with many people daily, give them a good mood, and get charged with positivity from them. Colleagues and visitors fondly remembered her friendliness, wit, and ability to find common ground with everyone. Soon another bright page appeared in Diana's life, a meeting with her beloved husband Scott. Genuine feelings, filled with tenderness, care, and laughter, flared up between them. Scott was captivated by Diana's beauty, wisdom, and soulfulness, while she saw in him a reliable life partner. The lovers planned to get married and build a cozy family nest where love and harmony would reign. Diana dreamed of growing old with Scott in this charming city, holding hands and rejoicing in the successes of their children and grandchildren. But despite her happy personal life, the core of Diana's existence remained her children. Her daughter was just finishing school and preparing for college, and Diana tirelessly worked to give her the opportunity to obtain the desired education. She wanted her smart girl to reach heights and realize her potential fully. Diana also strived to spend more time with her son, while he was still very small, travel together, discover the world, and build trusting relationships. For these two little hearts, Mom was the center of the universe. In her free time, Diana was passionate about handicrafts, knitting, embroidering, weaving with beads. Her products were full of love and warmth, which the woman generously shared with her relatives. Diana also cooked wonderfully. Her signature Cuban dishes were the highlight of all festive feasts. With special joy, she gathered a large family together to enjoy heartfelt communication and shower everyone with care and tenderness. Diana's radiant smile never left her face, as she was sincerely grateful for every lived day. Even in sorrow and hardship, this courageous woman did not despair but radiated hope and faith in the better. Her bright look and encouraging words were healing medicine for everyone who needed consolation and support. Wade Wilson was born around 1994 in a troubled family of teenagers. His biological parents were too young and immature to raise a child, so they gave Wade up for adoption to a couple from their church, Candy and Steve Wilson, who had 2 other daughters. The adopted son grew up problematic, and from a young age, he began breaking the law. Since 2010, Wade had been arrested over 20 times for theft, fraud, hooliganism, assaults. He repeatedly served terms in prison, including more than 3 months shortly before the October murders. In relationships with women, Wade also showed cruelty. He beat, raped, and threatened to kill. His ex-girlfriends described him as a monster capable of pretending to be a nice guy only to then torment them. 6 months before the tragedy, Wade reunited with 23-year-old Melissa Montanez, who endured his beatings and betrayals. Even when he was in prison, Melissa waited for him and gave him new chances. The girl hoped that his assurances of love, excuses for aggression with drugs, and mental disorders were sincere. But soon she realized that behind the attractive mask lay an emptiness, and that her life was in danger. Wade's father, Stephen, tried to maintain a relationship with him after the adoption, despite the problems with the law. He gave his son money, neglecting his own needs. It was to him that Wade turned, fleeing from the police and asking for money for a ticket. It was to him that he described his horrific crimes with strange delight. But even the father's years of devotion could not keep him from the horror of the monster his son had become. Stephen performed his civic duty by turning Wade into the police to protect others from harm. The decisive event for the bloody incidents was October 6, 2019. That Sunday evening, Wade Wilson had fun with his girlfriend Melissa at the Buddha Bar. A quarrel erupted between them over Wade's intention to visit someone's home. Melissa categorically refused to do this. Enraged, Wade went to Melissa's car supposedly for his things, but instead he got behind the wheel and fled, leaving his girlfriend. Melissa spent the night at a friend's house, and in the morning she discovered 8 missed calls from an unknown number, which belonged to Christine Melton. As it turned out, it was with Christine that Wade had met at the same Buddha Bar. The young couple quickly bonded over mutual sympathy and left the establishment together with Christine's friends. They continued the fun at the home of their new acquaintance, Jason, where passion flared between Wade and Christine. When the company dispersed in the early morning, Christine's friend Stephanie was calm to leave her with Wade, as she felt no alarming signs, and Christine herself assured that everything was fine. Wade, however, took advantage of the helpless sleeping girl to strangle her, wrap her in a sheet, and try to discreetly carry her out. But the stiff corpse proved too heavy, so the murderer simply left it in the house, stole the victim's phone and car, and disappeared. He immediately used the phone to quarrel with Melissa. The next victim of Wade was 43-year-old Diana Ruiz. She was simply walking to her morning shift at Moose Lodge when Wilson picked her up, pretending to be lost. As soon as Diana got into the car, he immediately attacked her, strangling her on the move. Then, in a deserted place, he dragged the still-living woman from the car and ran her over several times until her body was turned into a bloody pulp. Leaving the mutilated remains in the bushes, the killer calmly drove off to meet Melissa to beat her again. His confidence and impunity were striking in the midst of the attack on his girlfriend. He boasted to another acquaintance that he killed people at night. As soon as Melissa escaped, he got into Christine's stolen car and fled, leading the police on a chase. Obviously, the criminal acted impulsively under the influence of anger and excitement, not thinking about the consequences. He did not hide traces, did not dispose of the murder tools, and boasted about what he had done. Perhaps drug intoxication dulled his fear of punishment. Or maybe the thirst for violence simply clouded his mind and prompted him to kill again and again. No wonder one of his ex-girlfriends warned that Wade would eventually kill someone if he wasn't stopped. Unfortunately, they only stopped the monster after he had taken 2 priceless lives. Wilson returned to Cape Coral and headed straight to his girlfriend Melissa. At that time, she was at Mila Spa Salon, where Wade rushed at 8:45 am. Melissa didn't recognize the car he was driving. It was the grey Hellcat stolen from the murdered Christine. Enraged, Wade immediately started a scandal, demanding that Melissa get into the car. She refused, so Wade began forcibly dragging her into the salon. Crazed, Wilson was so eager to attack his girlfriend that he forgot to put the car in park. It rolled forward and hit another vehicle. Then he jumped out and with insane fury attacked Melissa. Despite her desperate resistance, the burly Wade quickly overpowered the delicate girl. He punched her in the face until blood flowed, bit her ear, grabbed her throat, and pinned her against the wall, threatening to kill her. And all this took place in broad daylight in front of people. Fortunately, passers-by intervened. Someone called the police. This allowed Melissa to escape from the clutches of the sadist. She ran away, leaving the attacker with nothing. Then the crazed Wilson jumped back into the stolen Hellcat and fled. An ambulance took Melissa, bruised, with abrasions and a split lip, away. The shocked girl could only think about living until her son's 15th birthday, which she hadn't even managed to congratulate him on yet. Fleeing pursuit, Wilson arrived at his acquaintance businessman Josh's place. He rushed to him in the office in despair, begging for money for a ticket out of town. Puzzled, Josh refused him. Then the crazed Wade blurted out, "You don't understand, Josh, I killed people yesterday." Stunned, the owner called the police, while Wilson hid somewhere in the backyard. Sometime later, Wade broke into the house of a couple who had just left town. Finding himself safe, he called his biological father Stephen and again began begging for help. This time, he told his father everything without concealment: how he strangled the sleeping Christine, calling her a bitch, how he picked up Diana, strangled her right behind the wheel, and then ran her over to make her into a cutlet. And he recounted all this with notes of delight and bravado in his voice, as if he was proud of his atrocities. Stephen was shocked by these horrific revelations. At first, he wanted to protect his son from punishment, but eventually realized that Wade was no longer the child he loved. The murderer had already caused harm and was ready to destroy further. So Stephen made a difficult but correct decision to turn Wade into the police before he could mutilate other lives. With a heavy heart, the father found out where his son was hiding and directed the authorities there under the pretext of calling a taxi. The police caught Wilson by surprise, and after half an hour of persuasion finally took him into custody. On the morning of October 7th, soon after Wade Wilson's attack on Melissa Montanez, Fort Myers police went to the scene of the incident at Mila Spa Salon. There they found the beaten Melissa, who detailed the attack by her ex and indicated that he had fled in a black Nissan Versa. The victim also told about the history of violence and drug addiction of Wade and expressed her fears that if he had managed to drag her into the car, he would have definitely killed her. According to her, he repeatedly threatened to execute her during the attack. Parallel to this, the Cape Coral police received a call about a suspicious death of 35-year-old Christine Melton in her house on Tudor Drive. At the scene, they found the body of the strangled woman in a sheet tied with her own clothes, as well as signs of a struggle and the disappearance of the victim's car. The gruesome discovery prompted the cops to classify the case as a murder. During her testimony, Wade's ex Melissa recalled that in the morning, he called her from a number that belonged to some Christine Melton from Cape Coral. This clue led investigators to suspect a connection between the attack on Melissa and the murder of Christine. While some law enforcement officers searched for traces of Wade Wilson, others set about establishing his identity by questioning acquaintances and relatives. Soon, the biological father of the suspect, Stephen Testiska, came forward. He reported that he had received several alarming calls from his son, who confessed to killing 2 people and begged for help to escape. At the insistence of the police, Stephen found out Wade's whereabouts and directed a squad there, assuring his son that he had ordered him a taxi. So around 10 p.m., Wilson was caught in a stranger's house, where he had broken in, hiding from the chase. At first, the criminal refused to surrender, but after half an hour of negotiations, he finally opened the door and ended up in handcuffs. The day after the arrest, Melissa Montanez informed investigators that Wade had called her from prison with declarations of love, but at the same time confessed to the murders of Christine Melton and Diana Ruiz. He detailed how he strangled both women with his bare hands because he just felt like it, while high. This moment of enlightenment finally convinced Melissa that Wade was a dangerous monster, skillfully manipulating emotions and pretending to be innocent. Meanwhile, Wade's father Stephen handed over a mobile phone to the police with a recording of all his son's confessions. Forensic analysis found traces of DNA and fingerprints of Wilson on Christine Melton's body. Blood stains and personal items of both Christine and Diana Ruiz were found in the salon of the Nissan Versa. The phone history of both deceased women also indicated calls from Wilson on the day of the murders. The totality of the evidence left no doubt about the detainee's guilt, despite his attempts to deny everything. Investigators diligently gathered testimonies that revealed the full depth of Wilson's moral degradation. His ex-girlfriends told about the abuse and beatings he inflicted with maniacal regularity. Wilson himself arrogantly boasted of his misdeeds and threatened to continue killing if he escaped. The police even prevented another attempt. Wilson's cellmate asked him to organize the murder of the mother of his child to avoid punishment for domestic violence. In letters to journalists from prison, Wilson rambled about a conspiracy against him and people who will not return. To one woman whose home he had once broken into, the criminal even sent threats from behind bars. He shamelessly traded interviews, promising to reveal some secrets, but all his stories turned out to be delusions. Overall, Wilson's behavior testified to deep corruption and self-centeredness. He was not at all concerned about the fate of his victims or close ones, only caring about his own skin. The trial of Wade Wilson lasted intermittently for 5 years. Sessions were postponed due to COVID restrictions, changes in the defendant's lawyers, or even the death of one of them. Wilson continuously received refusals on absurd petitions for bail or dismissal of the case. The audacious murderer even tried to escape from prison through a window with a fellow inmate. During this time, Wilson managed to make numerous tattoos on his face. The defense requested permission to hide these decorations with makeup so as not to shock the jurors, but the client proudly refused to do so. Finally, in June 2024, the selection of jurors began and the hearings commenced. In the dock sat 30-year-old Wade Wilson, not at all resembling the confident macho from the bars. His face was covered with sinister tattoos, his eyes darted around, and his lips twisted in inappropriate smiles. His entire appearance emitted something wild and untamed. Prosecutors convincingly proved Wilson's malicious intent and his guilt in 2 premeditated murders, assault, and car theft. Particularly striking to the jurors were the confessions of the defendant in the strangulation of the sleeping Christine and the bloody descriptions of the execution of Diana. The defense vainly tried to justify Wilson's atrocities with drug intoxication. The evidence was too eloquent. During the hearings, relatives and friends of the murdered women talked about their grief and pain from the loss. Diana's fiancé sobbed, recalling the last message from his beloved about how much she loved him. The son of the victim stuttered and trembled while giving testimony, so traumatized by his mother's death. Christine's friend Stephanie bitterly regretted trusting her friend to a merciless killer. Christine's relatives mourned the incredible girl, who was their support and favorite aunt for the children. Wade's ex-girlfriend Melissa openly called him a serial killer with empty eyes. Prosecutors emphasized that Wilson killed for the sake of killing, savoring the victim's pre-death torments. According to them, the crimes were the pinnacle of cynical disdain for life and a manifestation of deep hatred for women. This was indicated by his boasting of the executions, detailed descriptions of the agony of the strangled, and abuse of the mutilated bodies. The accusers convinced that Wilson would continue to kill if not stopped. In contrast, the defense attorneys argued that the defendant was a mentally ill drug addict, incapable of being responsible for his actions. They requested that Wilson be found guilty of only involuntary manslaughter of the second degree and given a chance for rehabilitation. The defendant himself refused to testify or apologize to the families of the victims. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury announced guilty on all counts, including 2 premeditated murders. Cries erupted in the courtroom. Relatives of Christine and Diana embraced, rejoicing in the long-awaited justice. Only Wilson stood impassively, though tears treacherously shimmered in his eyes. He faced the harshest punishment, the death penalty. Indeed, a week after the verdict, the jury gathered to determine the fate of the killer. This time, the session was brief. The majority of jurors agreed that Wade Wilson deserved the highest measure. According to new laws, the decision did not have to be unanimous. 8 out of 12 votes were enough. The judge only had to approve this verdict, and Wilson awaited a lethal injection. The deaths of Christine Melton and Diana Ruiz at the hands of Wade Wilson were a real shock to their relatives and the entire community of Cape Coral. The senseless and brutal death of 2 bright women, mothers, friends, colleagues, took a piece of soul from everyone who knew and loved them. Flourishing lives were cut short in an instant, leaving behind indescribable pain and emptiness. Stephanie, Christine's best friend, could not forgive herself for bringing a psychopathic killer into their circle. She constantly thought, what if she had acted differently that fateful night? Could she have saved Christine by being more cautious? These pangs of conscience tormented the girl every day, overshadowing the bright memories of their friendship. Christine's relatives' mother, brother, sister did not even have a chance to say goodbye to her until they identified the mutilated body in the morgue. They pleaded with the heavens for a miracle, hoping that some mistake had occurred. But the terrible truth soon confirmed. Christine was no more. She had died a horrific death at the hands of a monster she had imprudently trusted. Their lives were split into before and after, and their hearts were forever filled with sorrow, anger, and emptiness. An even worse fate befell Diana Ruiz's close ones. For 4 days, they did not know whether their beloved mother, daughter, fiancée, sister was alive. They called hospitals, morgues, police stations hundreds of times, hoping for a miracle. But when hope faded, they had to come to terms with the worst. Diana had died a martyr's death at the hands of a fiend. Diana's fiancé nearly went mad with grief. He blamed himself for not driving his beloved to work that tragic morning. Now the man could only visit her grave daily and weep bitterly, remembering their happy moments. Diana's son could hardly speak about his mother. Every word was an incredible effort. Each memory reopened the wound in his heart. The only consolation for the grieving families was that the murderer of their loved ones would suffer the severest punishment. It would not bring back the deceased, but at least it would quench the thirst for justice and protect others from the fate of Wilson's victims. The court's verdict, life imprisonment or execution, was some satisfaction for their suffering. For Melissa Montanez, the end of this story was also bittersweet. She barely escaped becoming the 3rd victim of her insane ex-lover and still could not comprehend how he so masterfully pretended to be an innocent lamb. The girl shuddered at the thought of what would have happened if she had believed his sweet promises and given him another chance. Would she have ended up in a suitcase with her throat slit? Only now did Melissa realize what a predator she had been involved with, and she was glad that she finally escaped his clutches, although the emotional scars would remind her of this painful experience for a long time. Inventive father Wade Stephen also received his share of moral torment. Despite all his love for his son, he realized that he had done the right thing by turning him into the police. Otherwise, Wilson Jr. would have continued killing innocents until a bullet stopped him. Yet, despite the pangs of conscience, Stephen blamed himself for not being able to raise Wade as a decent person. Although perhaps such monsters are born with a black soul, and no efforts can cleanse it. At least while justice caught up with Wilson as he deserved. When the jury delivered the verdict about the death penalty, the courtroom erupted in loud applause. Even the judge barely restrained a smile while reading the verdict, and only the murderer himself remained unmoved, as if he still did not feel guilty for his bloody deeds. However, some believed that life imprisonment among criminals would have been an even worse punishment for him than a quick death from an injection. The terrible story of Wade Wilson, Christine Melton, and Diana Ruiz is a warning to all of us. A warning that evil can hide behind an attractive mask, pretend to be a friend and lover. That impulse control and toxic masculinity combined with drugs are a ticking time bomb. That indifference to violence and the objectification of women can lead to a bloody tragedy. Perhaps if someone had stopped Wade during his first attacks on girlfriends, Diana and Christine would be alive. Christine Johnson, like many little girls, dreamed of a Hollywood star's life from childhood, being beautiful, wealthy, and famous. She grew up in a loving family, had a happy childhood, and ambitious plans for the future. Christine's desire to become famous came true, but unfortunately, not due to her talents, but because of the cruelty of her killer, and the details will shock you because her body was found with a torn-off ear. Born in 1981 in Santa Clara, California, Christine soon moved with her parents, Teresa and Kirk Johnson, to the small town of Saugatuck in Michigan. It was a cozy and picturesque place with a population of less than 1,000 people, where an atmosphere of peace and security prevailed. Crime here was extremely low, so locals didn't even lock their doors, not fearing criminals. Everyone in the community knew each other. Christine grew up along with her brother Derek, who was a few years older, in a family that seemed friendly and happy at first glance. However, the family idyll was shattered when the parents decided to divorce. Despite this, they maintained a good relationship for the sake of the children. According to the custody plan, Christine and Derek alternately lived with their mom and dad. Due to such circumstances, the girl got involved in household chores early and started helping her mother at the age of 12, including with the family budget. Striving for financial independence, Christine tried to get any job so as not to ask her parents for money. Meanwhile, her brother went to serve in the army and then decided to become a career military man. While studying in high school, Christine, having become independent, took her life into her own hands. Intelligence and natural beauty helped her in this. The girl was cheerful, fun, and an interesting conversationalist. She looked great thanks to an active and healthy lifestyle. Relatives, admiring Christine's beauty, advised her to conquer Hollywood. The girl got the most pleasure from sailing, surfing, and other water activities that she enjoyed when visiting her grandmother in California. However, after returning to Michigan, Christine missed her favorite hobbies and needed time to adjust to a different way of life. Here she became passionate about theater, being a member of a small acting group. In winter, she worked part-time as a waitress in a local cafe. Thanks to her friendliness, politeness, and sociability, Christine became a real find for the owner of the establishment, attracting more and more visitors. Christine increasingly thought about leaving the small town of Saugatuck. The measured life of the province did not appeal to her. The girl was convinced that she deserved something more than just serving food in a cafe. Christine saw no serious prospects for herself in this town. After graduating from high school in 1999, she finally gained enough freedom to start building her own life and path to success. Having thought over her situation, Christine decided to go in search of herself. The girl traveled to different cities, worked there, and tried her hand at various fields of activity. Eventually, in 2000, she chose California, which she loved so much, as her place of residence. This state attracted her with its wonderful climate and much wider opportunities for realizing her potential. At first, Christine moved in with her grandmother, who lived in the small resort town of Santa Maria with a population of 100,000 people. Despite being close to her favorite entertainment, the girl first focused on solving important issues. First of all, she started looking for a job, because providing for herself was very important to her. Christine got a job as a system administrator in the city's electric power company. Then she focused on her education and decided to enter the University of California. The educational institution was located a 40-minute drive from her grandmother's house. Christine successfully passed the entrance tests and bought a car with the money she had earned earlier. However, even with her own transport, daily trips over such long distances took too much of her time. Therefore, the girl began to look for a job closer to the university. This is how Christine first touched her dream Hollywood. She managed to get a part-time job with a film crew that was planning to shoot a movie. The experience of performing in a theater group helped the girl quickly adapt to the new working atmosphere. Eventually, she was hired as an assistant on the set of a thriller. Here, Christine met people who lived and breathed Hollywood. For a girl from the province, it was a real starry moment. She communicated with world-famous actors and directors and felt incredible happiness. Christine could not believe that she had the opportunity to interact with celebrities. The world of cinema completely captivated her. This work inspired young Christine so much that she wanted to be even closer to the film industry. The girl enrolled in professional makeup courses taught by Hollywood makeup artists. Having mastered these skills, she thought about becoming a makeup artist on a film set. For this, Christine was going to go to the city of her dreams, Los Angeles. Although it was quite a risky journey, curiosity overcame the fear of the unknown. The girl was irresistibly drawn to Hollywood. Eventually, Christine moved to Los Angeles, a city where several famous film studios are located at once. For a young and attractive girl, it was a real period of trials and temptations, but she demonstrated the best manners and decency that only a young lady is capable of. Despite the popular trends in the environment she found herself in, Christine did not lead a dissolute lifestyle. The girl avoided noisy parties and get-togethers, remaining a rather modest person. She had a relationship with a guy she had met a few years ago and continued to communicate with, overcoming the distance between them. Later, he moved to Christine, and starting from 2002, the young people decided to rent an apartment in Los Angeles together. Since they had not yet achieved financial stability, such a step was beneficial for both of them. It was a difficult adventure, but Christine did not lose heart and began to look for a new job on a permanent basis. However, difficulties arose with this. The girl managed to find only temporary part-time jobs, and there was no serious work. The lion's share of their joint budget was earned by her boyfriend. Meanwhile, relations between Christine and Todd became more and more tense. Later, the girl complained to her mother that verbal altercations with her beloved increasingly turned into physical violence on his part. She found herself trapped in a toxic relationship, complicated by financial hardship. Christine's mother began to look for new housing for her daughter so that she could move away from her problematic partner. Eventually, Christine broke up with her boyfriend and settled in a small apartment. She continued to get an education remotely. During this period, her father provided the girl with substantial financial support. He believed that his daughter would finally find her place in life and realize her calling, so he sought to help her in every possible way. By November 2002, Christine finally managed to get a job at a mobile communications company, but this position was far from her ideals. Neither the field of activity nor the level of income met the girl's expectations. In addition, Christine still could not find acceptable housing near her place of work. Instead, her mother found a cozy house in the town of Santa Monica, neighboring Los Angeles, which had to be shared with 2 more girls. The attractive thing was that it was located next to the beach in a lively residential area. It seemed like an ideal place to get on her feet, so Christine moved there. During this period, the girl transferred to the University of Santa Monica. Christine's dreams of Hollywood did not come true. She failed to start a career, her relationship with her beloved fell apart, and she was actually forced to start her life from scratch. However, the girl did not lose heart and continued to steadily go towards her dream. On February 15, 2003, Christine planned to attend a party. Before that, the young beauty visited a shopping center. She had a long phone conversation with her mother, during which they discussed the girl's plans for the future. This call was Christine's last contact with her loved ones. The next day, on Sunday, February 16, 2003, the mother was eagerly waiting for a call from her daughter, hoping to hear about how the previous day had gone. However, the girl never got in touch. The worried woman tried to call Christine herself, but her phone was unavailable. At first, this did not cause serious concern, because the daughter could be resting or at work and not hear the call. However, the next day there was still no news from Christine. Around 9 in the morning, the alarmed mother called her daughter's work. Christine was always in touch and answered calls, but this time an answering machine worked instead of her. Then the woman contacted the girl's manager, who informed her that she had not shown up for work. He emphasized that Christine was a very responsible employee, and during the last 3 months she had no delays or absenteeism. The girl's absence surprised all her colleagues, but they also could not reach her. As the manager said, Christine was last seen at work on February 14th. One of her co-workers recalled that the girl was going to some party. The mother of the missing girl visited her daughter's page on social networks, hoping to find useful information about this event. But in vain, Christine had not published a single photo. Although previously she actively maintained her profile, actually documenting every step of her life. The woman also checked her daughter's bank accounts, but no transactions had been made since her disappearance. In search of her daughter, the mother called all the hospitals, but Christine was not registered anywhere. So on February 17th, she decided to contact the Santa Monica Police Department with a statement about the disappearance of her 21-year-old daughter. The investigators checked whether a girl matching the description had been involved in traffic accidents during these days, but found nothing. The missing beauty's neighbors also heard nothing about her since her disappearance. The police turned to Kristine's ex-boyfriend, Todd, with whom she had a rather stormy and sometimes violent relationship. The version was considered that he could have found his beloved who had run away from him and done something to her, but the young man denied seeing the girl. Kristine's neighbors were only able to provide superficial information about the last day they saw the girl. According to them, on Saturday, February 15th, the missing girl was going to some party, but with whom and where exactly they did not know. The same information came from the girl's colleagues when they communicated with her mother. This clue became the first in the investigation, so the detectives began to carefully check it. Later, another detective joined the case. While reviewing the collected materials, he was struck by the photo of the missing girl. The crime victim bore a striking resemblance to another girl who had disappeared earlier and was found dead in 1995. That girl, starting her modeling career, agreed to a photo shoot for the glossy magazine Photographer. But these plans were not destined to come true. It was about Linda Sobek, killed by photographer Charles Redburn. He lured the beautiful blonde out of town by deception, where he dishonored and took her life. The policeman knew that at the time of Kristine's disappearance, Linda's killer was already serving a sentence in prison, so physically he could not be involved in the new crime. However, it could be a follower of Charles who was inspired by his scheme of action. Detectives needed at least some clue related to the missing girl, so they put out an alert for her car, a white Mazda Miata. At the same time, while communicating with Kristine's mother, investigators found out more details about the girl's ex-boyfriend Todd, and also learned the name of her new chosen one, Lucas. However, the woman knew very little about the latter. She could not even name his last name, which greatly complicated the search. More than 48 hours had passed since Kristine's disappearance, a critical period in such cases. The police seriously considered the possibility that the girl might already be dead. They began to analyze the billing data of her mobile phone. It turned out that the last outgoing call was made on February 15th at 17:34. Kristine called the directory service at 411, which could indicate that she was in trouble and was trying to clarify an address or someone's phone number. The conversation lasted about 3 minutes, so this communication could be of great importance for the investigation. Unfortunately, it was not possible to find out the exact content of the dialogue, since such calls were not recorded. After that conversation, the girl's mobile phone was discharged. The last location of the gadget, recorded by the system, indicated the area of Ventura Boulevard. The police decided to involve the media in the investigation. The headlines immediately featured messages about Kristine's disappearance with hints of the similarity of this case to Linda's murder. In search of clues, investigators carefully searched the apartment where Kristine lived. Among the finds was a receipt from a lingerie store, dated the day the girl disappeared, February 15th. The police managed to find out that, despite the aggressive behavior of her ex-boyfriend, Kristine continued to maintain contact with him. Sometimes she visited him, the last time on February 7th. But the detectives managed to find the most serious clue while studying the missing girl's email. On February 13th, Kristine sent a message to the party coordinator, in which she expressed a passionate anticipation of the holiday and her intention to buy a ticket. In response, she was informed about the complete sale of tickets, but assured that she would be included in a separate waiting list. This is a fairly common practice among organizers of events. With the participation of celebrities in this way, they encourage visitors to buy VIP tickets at greatly inflated prices. Finally, the police managed to find Kristine's new boyfriend, Lucas, and talk to him. According to the young man, he last saw the girl on February 14th, the day before her disappearance. They watched a movie together, after which they parted. Lucas successfully passed a polygraph test, had a reliable alibi, and did not arouse any suspicion among the investigators. Later, the detectives interrogated Kristine's ex-boyfriend Todd, but he also had an alibi, confirmed by several witnesses. It turned out that at the time of the girl's disappearance, Todd was out of town. Among all the versions, the police were most interested in the one that was associated with the party where Kristine was heading and from where she never returned. Investigators were convinced that the key to unraveling the girl's disappearance lies here. They contacted the organizers of the event and were shocked by what they heard. It turns out that Kristine never bought a ticket and did not show up at the party. But where did the girl go then? To restore the chronology of events on the fateful evening, the police tracked transactions from the missing girl's bank card. This helped to establish all the stores that Christine visited that day. Law enforcement officers carefully reviewed the recordings from video surveillance cameras in these establishments, hoping to identify something extraordinary or stumble upon clues. But this painstaking work took a lot of time. In parallel with the analysis of these data, the police received an alarming call. A woman named Susan Murphy reported a suspicious guy she met at a store. He introduced himself as Victor Thomas, an employee of a film company that conducts casting for a new James Bond movie. The man began to put psychological pressure on Susan, inviting her to the role of Bond's girl and admiring her beauty. He persistently inclined the woman to participate in the casting, but this seemed extremely suspicious to her. Susan barely managed to refuse at the last moment. Fortunately, she went to meet with the stranger accompanied by her husband, a former police officer. Susan's husband personally spoke with Victor, trying to inquire about his true intentions, but the suspect suddenly fled without providing any useful information. Later, Susan decided to check all the data she knew about Victor and found out that he was lying. Victor Thomas had nothing to do with the film industry. Moreover, a person with that name did not exist at all. It seems that the man invented a legend, similar to Linda Sabik's killer, in order to meet a beautiful woman. But for what purpose remained a mystery. Although Susan's story ended well, Victor was still at large and could continue his shenanigans. Therefore, the police urgently began to check the received information and search for the suspicious guy. It was quite possible that he had evil intentions. Investigators studied the recordings from surveillance cameras of all the stores where Christine made purchases on the eve of her disappearance, but found nothing worthy of attention. Then they decided to go around the shops and interview the staff. The salespeople were shown a sketch of Victor, who allegedly harassed beautiful girls. In one of the stores, the cashier recalled seeing a similar man, but could not provide any more details. Eventually, an artist arrived on the scene to compile a sketch of the suspect. The search for Christine was gaining momentum. Dog handlers with dogs and volunteers were sent to the area from where the girl last got in touch and called the directory service. Patrols and volunteers continued to look for the missing girl's car and Christine herself. There were many messages from citizens that a similar car was seen in different places, but all these clues turned out to be false. Finally, on February 24th, an important signal was received by the police. In the parking lot of the shopping center that Christine visited on the day of her disappearance, her car was found a white Mazda Miata. The forensic expert who arrived at the scene conducted a thorough inspection of the interior, seized fingerprints and all potential evidence. A bottle of water was found on the back seat, and the missing girl's mobile phone was on the front seat. But the investigators were most surprised by the story of the parking lot guard. The man recalled a strange incident related to this car. The car drove into the spot at 17:45, although it was reserved for another client. Some man got out of the car who, upon hearing the guard's remark, behaved extremely aggressively. The stranger threw the car keys at the guard and left without any explanation. There was no one in the cabin at that time. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in the parking lot, so it was not possible to see the driver. Having no clues, the detectives decided to return to the analysis of Christine's purchases on the day of her disappearance. What they found shocked the investigators. On the eve of her disappearance, the girl bought clothes that exactly matched the description provided by Susan. When inviting the woman to the casting, Victor asked her to wear an extremely short black mini-skirt, a white blouse, stockings, and shoes. It was these very items that were paid for with Christine's credit card. The police ruled out the possibility of a simple coincidence. It seemed that the girl had fallen for the bait of a fraudster whose true motives remained a mystery. Christine repeated Susan's fate. Only the latter was lucky to have an escort in the form of her husband. Unfortunately, no information about the mysterious Victor could be found, and law enforcement officers were at an impasse. They turned to Christine's roommates again. The girls recalled that the missing woman was indeed going to some kind of casting, but they could not provide any details. During the conversation, they managed to remember that the audition was definitely related to a James Bond movie. According to them, Christine was extremely excited on the eve of the event. The description of her outfit, a blouse and a mini-skirt in which she left the house, completely coincided with the officers' fears. Christine was very afraid of being late for the casting scheduled for 17:30. She was wearing the exact revealing clothes that the villain had asked Susan to wear, and possibly Christine herself. Detectives continued to review the surveillance camera footage over and over again, hoping to find Victor. Eventually, they managed to spot the right man in the store where the employees mentioned him. However, the video quality was so low that it was impossible to make out facial features. Still, it was at least some kind of lead. Using eyewitness testimony, investigators were able to compile an approximate portrait of the suspect. By February 26th, a sketch of the main suspect in the disappearance of the young beauty was created. One of the experienced detectives, having familiarized himself with the case materials, recognized Victor Paleologos in it, who had been released on parole very recently, on January 20th, 23. In the past, the man had already been convicted of a sexual crime. Among the episodes of his rich criminal past, there was a case when he lured a woman named Kristi Kludgian to his apartment in a similar manner. After inviting her to a supposedly noisy party with celebrities, Victor met the victim in an empty, quiet house. There he began to harass the guest, and when she resisted, he attacked her. The attacker used a rope, strangled Kristi with it, and then tried to tie the woman up for violence. But the victim had enough strength to break free, run out of the apartment, and call the neighbors for help. Victor Paleologos used the same scheme, luring victims with promises of casting or invitations to parties. This technique worked flawlessly, especially near the Walk of Fame. Many girls came to Los Angeles in search of fulfilling their Hollywood dream, and villains like Victor took advantage of this. For the first attack on a girl, Paleologos got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, there was an attempt to dishonor Katie DeBiono in 1998. Then he called himself Brian, a movie producer. For this crime, he was punished with a minimum term. There was reason to believe that Victor was also involved in embezzlement of funds in the company where he previously worked. In addition, the police identified many other victims, women whom Paleologos tried to use. However, all the statements of the victims were ignored by law enforcement officers due to lack of evidence. Once Victor broke into the house of his ex-girlfriend, although he did not manage to bring his criminal intent to the end, the man still stole money and jewelry from the home. And even for this act, he got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, an even more serious case occurred. Victor lured a girl named Heather into a trap. As always, he incited her to dress in a seductive manner. It seems that this particular appearance of the victim excited him the most. Then Paleologos tried to tie the girl up in order to get intimate, but Heather miraculously managed to break free. Somehow she managed to push the attacker away with the sharp heel of her shoe. These precious seconds allowed her to run out of the trap and hide in her own car. The girl filed a statement against the offender. For this crime, Victor received 2 years in prison, but was released on parole on January 20th, 2003. This happened just 3 weeks before Kristi's disappearance. It seems that once at liberty, the repeat offender took up the old. By the time the police got on the trail of Paleologos, he had already been arrested. This time he stole a BMW X5 in Beverly Hills and tried to sell the car with forged documents. The detainee was found to have a wallet with a whole bunch of stolen IDs, credit cards, and other documents. Victor perfectly matched the type of criminal involved in Kristi's disappearance. His handwriting completely coincided with what was known to the investigation. All the facts pointed to Paleologos, so the detectives decided to show his photo to Susan, who avoided the attack thanks to the intervention of her husband. At the police station, Susan unhesitatingly pointed to Victor's photograph among other pictures. Later, during the identification procedure, she again unmistakably identified him, noting that she immediately recognized the man, despite obvious attempts to change his appearance. Paleologos slouched a little, extended one arm, making it longer than the other, and combed his hair in a new way. But all these tricks did not help him avoid exposure. During a separate check, Susan's husband, who once tried to detain the criminal, also recognized him. Unfortunately, the parking lot guard where the missing girl's car was found could not identify the suspect. He only managed to see Victor for a moment from afar and in the dark, without seeing his face. At the time the photo was presented, Paleologos was already behind bars, although on the day of Kristi's disappearance he was still at large. During the interrogation, the suspect denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance and flatly refused to admit the fact of communicating with Susan, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence to the contrary. Victor refused to testify without a lawyer, explaining this by his recent parole and fears that he was being framed. So the detectives continued to collect evidence against him. Soon a new witness came forward, a realtor who had been working with Victor for the last few weeks and noticed some oddities in his behavior. Paleologos was looking through a real estate agent for a house worth up to $700,000. They inspected several properties every day, when suddenly a message came about the disappearance of documents and keys from one of the houses. Then the realtor did not even suspect that his client could be involved in this. But as soon as he saw Victor's photo in the news summary, everything fell into place. The witness also identified the suspect. According to him, their last meeting took place just a day before Kristine's disappearance. Then Victor behaved strangely. He was somewhat nervous. In one of the inspected houses, he went to the toilet and began to shout loudly from there, allegedly checking the quality of sound insulation. The police suggested that this way the man could look for a place for his criminal actions, where the screams of the victims would remain unheard. Detectives examined all the houses that Paleologos visited. They paid special attention to the object that so intrigued the suspect. Interestingly, this dwelling was located in the same area where Kristine's mobile phone signal was last recorded. Investigators literally turned the house upside down, looking for at least some evidence of Victor's involvement in the girl's disappearance or her possible body, but found nothing. Meanwhile, searches continued in Paleologos' apartment. Photos of women in clothes that the suspect seemed to especially like were found on his computer. A short skirt, a white blouse, stockings, and high-heeled shoes. It had been 12 days since the start of the investigation, but the missing girl's family still cherished the hope of Kristine returning home alive. Victor continued to deny everything and was in no hurry to share any information with the police. He only confirmed the fact of meeting the girl, after which, according to him, they went their separate ways and he did not see her again. Victor Paleologos was born in 1962 in Pennsylvania into an ordinary family. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. The man graduated from college with a bachelor's degree, after which he entered graduate school in Los Angeles. From 1990 to 1993, he was married. Interestingly, some facts indicated that in 1991 Victor could have tried to poison his wife when she filed a statement against him. All of Paleologos' attempts to organize his own restaurant business failed. It seemed that this was a world-weary loser who had slipped into a life of crime. It seems that Victor's fetish for beautiful women forced him to cross a dangerous line, and he began to attack them for the purpose of intimacy and sexual gratification. Regarding the evening of Kristine's disappearance, Paleologos, together with his lawyer, provided an alibi. Allegedly, Victor had dinner with an acquaintance in a restaurant. This information was indeed confirmed, but law enforcement officers understood that despite this, the man still had enough time to play out another criminal drama and kidnap a new victim. On March 1st, another witness called the police. According to his statement, on February 15th, he saw the missing girl. She stopped near his house in search of some mansion that resembled a castle. The man could not help her because he himself did not know where this building was located. Instead, his wife, hearing their conversation, told Kristine the direction. The incident occurred around 1730. Now it became clear for what purpose the girl dialed the number of the directory service 411. She needed navigation to a building that looked like a castle. Investigators had a new lead. Moreover, it was in such a house that Victor checked the quality of sound insulation. Everything pointed to him. While the detectives were working with this data, a new event occurred. On March 3, 2003, 4 teenage friends were walking through the Hollywood Hills, admiring the picturesque panorama of Los Angeles. Suddenly, one of the guys, approaching the edge of a cliff, noticed some strange object below, 100 meters from him. At first, the young men thought it was a mannequin. They tried to go down to take a closer look at the find, but could not overcome the entire distance. However, this was enough to understand that it was a human body. The frightened guys for a long time could not decide what to do next, because none of them took a mobile phone with them. Eventually, they went to the police station. On the way, the teenagers met a woman who was walking dogs and told her about the horrendous find. She approached the body to make sure the guys were not mistaken. The victim was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt. Her legs were tied and wrapped in blue fabric. The hands of the deceased were behind her back, and a hairband was on her right wrist. Below the waist, tattered stockings were visible. Frightened by what she saw, the woman called the police. Soon, law enforcement officers and rescuers arrived at the scene. They had to sweat a lot to get the mutilated body from the hard-to-reach area. Obviously, the criminal hoped that his victim would never be found here. Perhaps this would have happened if it were not for the quick-witted teenagers who accidentally wandered into this deserted area. The forensic expert identified the deceased as the missing Kristine Johnson. her body was found not far from the house that Victor liked so much during the real estate viewing with the realtor. The girl's parents were immediately informed about the tragic news, who could not believe the reality of what had happened and did not hold back their despair over the loss of their daughter. Kristine's entire body was covered with bruises and scratches, indicating desperate attempts to resist. The corpse was in a terrible condition and had time to undergo significant putrefactive changes, lying under the scorching sun for more than 1 day. In addition, it rained 1 day. The face was especially disfigured, which was facilitated by both numerous injuries and the unnatural position of the deceased's body with her head lowered. Someone tore off the girl's ear. The expert also noted large bruises on Kristine's head and neck, which indicated a traumatic brain injury and strangulation. Initially, this was recognized as the cause of death, but soon even more horrific details were clarified. Investigators had no doubt that it was Victor Paleologos who was involved in the murder of Kristine Johnson. However, it was necessary to prove that at the time of the girl's death, the suspect did not have an alibi. For this purpose, the detectives went to Joey, an acquaintance with whom Victor allegedly had dinner that fatal evening. But it turned out that in fact it was not a friend, but a casual acquaintance. During a thorough interrogation, the man admitted that he and Victor had agreed to meet much later than the incident with Kristine occurred. According to Joey, they met Paleologos only the day before. On February 15th, Victor was late for the meeting, arriving around midnight, although they initially planned to meet much earlier. The suspect's face had fresh scratches, which he explained as an accidental injury during the move. The police step-by-step recreated the probable sequence of events that preceded the disappearance of Kristine Johnson. According to the investigation, the criminal noticed a beautiful young girl in a shopping center where he often hunted for victims and decided to act according to the usual scenario. He introduced himself as a film industry worker and offered Kristine to audition for the role of James Bond's girl. Victor was remarkably convincing. Acting according to a well-established scheme, he showered the girl with compliments, assuring that she was perfect for this role. Given Kristine's youth and ambitions, she believed the villain and could not refuse the tempting offer. Paleologos scheduled a meeting in one of the houses that he recently inspected with a realtor, explaining that this was where the audition would take place. Kristine, somewhere deep down suspecting a trap, still prepared for the casting and dressed the way Victor asked. She arrived at the place with a slight delay, as she got lost on the way and contacted the directory service. This is how the girl found herself in the clutches of a deadly trap from which she never got out. During the meeting, Kristine became a victim of Victor's harassment, but desperately resisted and even managed to scratch his face. But she had nowhere to run, and the physically stronger man quickly overcame the resistance. Paleologos dishonored the helpless girl and then killed her to get rid of an unwanted witness. First, he hit her on the head and strangled her, and only then threw the mutilated body into the Hollywood Hills. But the most terrible thing was that the traumatic brain injury and strangulation did not lead to Kristine's instant death. The girl only lost consciousness, and the inhuman Victor mistook it for death. By throwing the body off a cliff, he doomed the victim to a slow and painful death. Kristine, having fallen from a considerable height, received numerous fractures and internal injuries. She regained consciousness for some time, but never waited for rescue, bleeding to death alone. Only a few hours later, the girl finally died from her injuries. On May 12, 2003, the district attorney officially charged Victor Paleologos with kidnapping, violence, and first-degree murder. However, the defense was fully prepared to defend the client's innocence because there was a lack of direct evidence of his guilt. The prosecution faced a difficult battle, so forensic experts used all the available weighty arguments. Victor's lawyers questioned the time of the victim's death, referring to the insects found on the body. Instead, prosecutors emphasized the striking similarity of the killer's handwriting with previous attacks on women. The cases were so identical that it was impossible not to mention them in court. Preparation for the trial was delayed, so Victor Paleologos appeared before the jury only in July 2006. The defense emphasized that the prosecution actually had no material evidence against the defendant, no DNA analysis, no fingerprints, no video surveillance recordings that would link him to the murder. This was explained by the fact that Kristine's mutilated body was found only 2 weeks after her disappearance, and during this time most of the traces had time to deteriorate. However, the testimony of women accusing Victor of harassment and attacks was more than enough. After their statements, the sympathies were on the side of the prosecution. Without exception, all the victims talked about Victor's remarkable talent for manipulation. The man was so careful and convincing that even the most cautious victims like Susan Murphy initially believed his sweet promises and agreed to take part in the alleged casting, not even suspecting what was really waiting for them. It seemed that after hearing this, no one had any doubts that it was Victor Paleologos who killed the unfortunate Christine. But the defendant had a last ace up his sleeve. To avoid the death penalty, Victor proposed to make a deal with the investigation and plead guilty to a less serious crime. Now the fate of Paleologos was in the hands of the relatives of the deceased girl. At that time, the exhausting trial had been going on for 3 weeks and threatened to drag on for a long time. Given the uncertainty of the verdict and the burden of the grief experienced, Christine's family agreed to make concessions in exchange for a confession. However, Victor unexpectedly changed his mind, and on the day of sentencing sent the judge an 11-page petition asking to cancel his confession. Fortunately, the law was on the side of justice, and it was no longer possible to cancel the previous statement. The court found Victor Paleologos guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 25 years. If you like this story, support the author with a like and subscription to the channel. And in the comments, share your impressions and thoughts about the investigation of this high-profile case. I also invite you to watch other videos published on the channel. Many thanks for watching. I love you and see you next time. Every 7 minutes in America, a woman dies at the hands of her partner. Jessica Chambers, at just 19, suffered a brutal attack from someone she knew she was burned alive. In excruciating agony, engulfed in flames, the girl tried to utter the killer's name until her last breath. This story is yet another reminder of how cautious women need to be today. I hope this account will help you protect yourself and your loved ones from harm. Jessica was born on February 2nd, 1995, in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Her parents divorced when she was just 3 years old. Later, her father remarried a woman who already had children, so Jessica gained 7 step siblings. Despite having such a large family, the girl's childhood was not easy. Her father was involved in the production of illegal substances for a long time until he was arrested and imprisoned. Jessica grew up in a harsh, marginalized environment. However, unlike many other criminals, her father managed to break the vicious cycle of crime after his release from prison. He got a job as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. Jessica grew up in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi. In fact, it was more like a village, with a population of less than 500 people at the time of the events described. However, unlike some other small settlements, Cortland became a haven for not-so-upstanding individuals. The crime rate here was, on average, 50% higher than in the country as a whole. Historically, most of the local residents were somehow connected to the criminal world. But young Jessica seemed to pay no attention to this. She grew up peacefully and studied in high school, where she was a cheerleader and an excellent student thanks to her academic abilities. She had a high GPA upon graduation. However, Jessica constantly faced problems in her personal life. For a long time, she lived with her mother, who had a difficult personality. When the girl started dating a boy who lived across the street, her mother reacted extremely negatively. The woman tried to control her daughter and disapproved of her choice of boyfriend. Due to constant conflicts, Jessica was eventually forced to move out from her mother's place. Fortunately, she didn't have to go far, just a few blocks away, where her father lived with his new wife, Debbie. This even somewhat improved Jessica's relationship with her mother, so the girl regularly stayed at her place. However, the teenager's life was quite stressful, and in 2012, another tragic blow occurred. Her brother, to whom Jessica was very close, died in a car accident. This loss knocked her off course for a long time. But despite everything, Jessica graduated from high school and got a job at a supermarket as a clothing saleswoman to start earning a living. However, behind the idyllic facade, there was also a dark side to the girl's life. She occasionally smoked marijuana. Once, this even led to her arrest. But even this did not worsen people's attitudes towards Jessica, as she continued to be a kind and good person. And against the backdrop of the criminal records of most of the town's residents, her detention for prohibited substances seemed like a trifle not worth paying attention to. However, it was after this that a series of events began that might have ultimately led the girl to a tragic end. 19-year-old Jessica was dating 28-year-old Travis Sanford, who was serving time in prison at the time. The guy's criminal past did not bother the girl. She patiently waited for his release. After all, Jessica grew up in an atmosphere associated with crime since childhood, and the town itself had a bad reputation in this regard. Even her own father had served time in prison before getting on the path of an honest life. So for Jessica, things like jail time was something commonplace and not worth special attention. On December 6, 2014, at approximately 4 p.m., Jessica was visiting her mother, Lisa. She planned to quickly stop by the gas station and return immediately. However, the girl disappeared for a long time. The trip should have taken a maximum of 10-15 minutes, but even after 2 hours, Jessica still hadn't shown up. Worried, Lisa sent her daughter a message asking when she would be back home, but there was no response. Then the woman tried calling Jessica's cell phone, but again, she didn't answer. Lisa's anxiety grew. She called one more time. This time, her daughter picked up. Barely audible, she whispered into the phone that she would be home soon and that everything was fine. This was extremely unusual. Normally, Jessica liked to listen to music loudly, and wherever she was, there was always some noise in the background. But this time, there was dead silence on the other end. This greatly alarmed Lisa, but she calmed down a bit as she managed to reach her daughter, who assured her that everything was okay. After a short conversation, they said goodbye. No one could have imagined that in just a few hours, the girl's parents would receive terrible news. Around 8 p.m., 911 emergency services received a disturbing call from 2 local residents. They reported that a Kia Rio car was burning in the Batesville area. Firefighters arrived at the scene in just 2 minutes. But as soon as they began to extinguish the fire, a dark figure emerged from the adjacent wooded area. The rescuers turned one of their vehicles so that its headlights illuminated the approaching silhouette. What they saw shocked them to the core. Stumbling towards them, barely able to move her legs, was a girl whose body was almost completely burned and disfigured by terrible burns. She was so severely mutilated by the fire that it was simply impossible to recognize her. With a pleading moan, the girl stretched out her charred arms to the rescuers and then fell to the ground just 2 meters away from them, no longer having the strength to move. There she lay, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. By that time, the car had almost completely burned out. The flames mainly engulfed the engine compartment and the interior, while the trunk suffered minimal damage. While one part of the fire brigade continued to battle the blaze, one of the rescuers set about providing first aid to the victim. He wrapped her in a blanket, knowing that after severe burns, a person often feels cold. Soon, police officers arrived at the scene to question the 2 men who had discovered the burning car and called the emergency services. They were clearly alarmed by the horrific condition of the burned girl. They immediately suspected that this fire was no accident. The victim needed to be taken to the hospital as soon as possible. The sight was gruesome. The girl was completely covered in burns, with only charred underwear remaining on her body. One of the law enforcement officers supported her, trying to calm her down, and asked a few questions. The victim's entire body was covered in third-degree burns, her hair and eyebrows completely singed off. The girl couldn't even speak normally. The policeman first tried to find out her name, but she could barely utter individual sounds. He had to lean in very close to her face, almost pressing his ear to her mutilated lips to make out anything at all. At first, he misheard the girl's name, but looking into her eyes, he recognized her as Jessica Chambers, a local resident. Then he asked who had done this to her. Mustering her last strength, the unfortunate victim tried to say the name of her attacker. The police officer thought he heard the word water. At that moment, the girl lost consciousness. Meanwhile, paramedics arrived at the scene. They immediately tried to revive Jessica by performing cardiac massage. It worked. The girl regained consciousness for a moment. One of the eyewitnesses recognized the burned-out car as Jessica's vehicle. In such a small town, everyone knew each other. So, thanks to the prompt actions of the medics, Jessica briefly regained consciousness. The police immediately tried to find out who else was in the car with her right before the tragedy. A crowd of onlookers had already gathered around the burning vehicle. Their noise and whispering greatly interfered with the investigation. It was extremely difficult for the police officer to make out the quiet whispers of the burned girl. But despite everything, he managed to catch the name Eric, although he wasn't entirely sure of what he heard. The law enforcement officer asked someone to bring a sheet of paper and a pen so that Jessica could write down the suspect's name herself. But unfortunately, this turned out to be impossible. The girl's hands were too badly damaged by the fire. She could no longer move them, let alone write. After asking the victim several times, the policeman tried to confirm whether anyone present in the car was named Derek or Eric. They didn't have time to find out anything else. The paramedics had already loaded Jessica into the ambulance to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. On the way to the hospital, the medics continued to question Jessica, trying to find out the name of the perpetrator. To make sure they understood correctly what the victim's name was, the paramedic asked again if her name was indeed Jessica Chambers. The girl nodded affirmatively in response. After that, she tried again to say the name of her attacker. The medics suggested options Eric or Derek, but Jessica shook her head in denial. The ambulance took the girl to Regional One Health Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. There, doctors began a desperate fight for her life. Meanwhile, the police informed Jessica's parents of the terrible news about the fire and their daughter's critical condition. The family was an hour's drive away from the medical center where the girl was taken. Ben, Jessica's father, picked up her mother, Lisa, and together they rushed to the hospital, hoping to see their daughter alive and find out what had happened to her. The road seemed endless, thoughts of the worst never leaving the parents' minds for a moment. They arrived in Memphis sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. When Lisa entered the ward and saw the body mutilated by fire, she immediately recognized her daughter in it, even though the girl was burned beyond recognition. Jessica's eyes were closed. She was barely breathing. The mother leaned over the bed and whispered in her daughter's ear that everything would be all right now, since she and her father were there. But a few minutes later, Jessica Chambers died from her injuries. The fire had damaged 93% of her body, leaving only a small area of her neck unaffected. The burns were so deep, mostly second and third degree, that the girl had virtually no chance of survival. Almost all the residents of the town, over 400 people, came to the funeral chapel to say goodbye to 19-year-old Jessica. Among them were her classmates, who left touching inscriptions and memories on the white metal coffin with permanent markers. Everyone was troubled by the same question: who could have committed such a brutal crime against the young cheerleader? Some leaned towards the version that it could have been an accident, perhaps a car crash. But the police immediately rejected this assumption, since at the scene, neither on the road nor on the roadside, they found no traces of another vehicle. Moreover, despite the fact that the car had completely burned out, there were no characteristic signs of impact damage on it. The investigators considered an intentional murder the most likely scenario, especially since Jessica tried to name the attacker's name until the very end. To stir up the public, the police released information about this incident to the media. A reward of $1,000 was announced for any information that would help find the perpetrator. Detectives visited the home of the victim's mother, Lisa, to restore the chronology of events on the last day of Jessica's life with her help. The investigators were also interested in who the girl communicated with and whether there were any suspicious or potentially dangerous individuals among her acquaintances. Lisa said that around 2 p.m., her daughter had come home and gone to take a nap in the living room. At 4:25 p.m., she was awakened by a call on her cell phone. After talking to someone for a few minutes, Jessica told her mother that she needed to stop by the gas station nearby. There were no interesting places in this area. The only place the girl could have gone to was the local 24-hour store. The detectives decided to question the cashier who was on shift that fateful day. Maybe he had noticed something suspicious and could share useful information with the police. At the store, they were met by Ali Alani. He reported that he had indeed seen a girl who matched the description of the murdered Jessica. The salesman fully cooperated with the investigation. He provided access to the surveillance camera recordings. The video showed that at 6:25 p.m., Jessica approached the doors but did not enter the store because someone called out to her. The girl looked back and waved to someone who remained off camera. Then she headed in that direction and also disappeared from the camera's view. For several minutes, she was not visible. It is unknown what happened during that time. Then Jessica reappeared at the store's doors, went inside, paid for gas, and drove away. The police did not notice anything suspicious in Ali's behavior, but the local residents had a different opinion. When it became known that the cashier was the last person who had definitely seen Jessica alive, many in the town believed that it was he who had killed her. There were even witnesses who claimed that Alani was a member of a local criminal gang. So the person who first helped the investigation with valuable information suddenly fell out of favor with the community. However, the law enforcement officers soon refuted his involvement in the crime. Ali had an ironclad alibi. Surveillance camera recordings confirmed that the man had been at his workplace all evening and all night. Moreover, he successfully passed a lie detector test. In the end, the detectives had to appear on local television with an official statement to protect Ali from the people's anger. The head of the police personally announced that the store clerk was not involved in Jessica Chambers' death. Gradually, passion subsided, and the cashier was left alone. By that time, the investigators already had preliminary results of the examinations. Forensic experts established that the girl had been doused with a flammable liquid, most likely gasoline or kerosene, and then set on fire. This was what caused the terrible burns that left her no chance of survival. The flames that engulfed her fuel-soaked clothing were impossible to extinguish. It's terrifying to even imagine the torment Jessica endured before her heart stopped in the hospital. At the burned-out car, charred scraps of fabric were found, which belonged to the victim's underwear. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of traces of gasoline on them. Interrogating the town's men one by one, the detectives tried to find someone named Derek or Eric, and also closely watched Jessica's official boyfriend Travis Sanford. However, the latter had to be crossed off the list of suspects, since at the time of the attack, he was in prison. The public continued to help the investigation in their own way. At first, they almost lynched Ali, who was later officially acquitted, and now the rumor mill was accusing Jessica's father, Ben Chambers. Many believed that having a criminal record in the past automatically made him a suspect in the murder of his own daughter. Some even recalled that Ben had once expressed racist views, and his daughter had just started a relationship with a boy of a different skin color. Could the enraged father have decided to teach the disobedient Jessica a lesson? To deflect suspicion from himself and not interfere with the investigation, Ben agreed to take a polygraph test and provided an alibi. After that, he also publicly emphasized that he had no prejudice against people of other races. Despite his criminal past, the man insisted that he loved his daughter very much and would never have harmed her. Meanwhile, the detectives talked to the victim's closest friend, Keisha. The girl said that on the day of the tragedy, she and Jessica had walked around town together and then rode in a car. Closer to noon, they were joined by 27-year-old Quinton Tellez. The young people chatted a bit, smoked marijuana, after which Jessica and Kesha dropped Quinton off at the same 24-hour store where Jessica was last seen alive. The guy had a rather bad reputation in town and problems with the law. He had been detained for theft, violation of the inviolability of the home, and assault. Quinton had met Jessica only a couple of weeks before her death, so they were not well acquainted. Upon learning about this connection, the investigators immediately contacted Tellez to talk. At the meeting, he behaved very amiably and willingly answered questions. Quinton reported that he did not know Jessica all that well. Allegedly, they had communicated for a very short time and were generally just acquaintances. On that ill-fated day, he met the girls by chance, and then they simply gave him a ride to the store. Of course, the guy denied any involvement in the subsequent tragic events. Quinton's story sounded quite plausible. Moreover, during the interrogation, he remained calm and at ease. Then the investigators asked Tellez if he knew anyone named Derek or Eric. After all, these were the names Jessica mentioned before her death. Quinton immediately recalled Derek Holmes, who allegedly behaved a bit strangely with Jessica. He said that Derek had repeatedly pestered the girl with offers to date, but she refused every time. This happened on the day Quinton was riding in the car with the friends Derek allegedly tried to hit on Chambers again. The police became interested in this information. Soon, the detectives visited Derek Holmes' home to talk. Despite some oddities, he did not arouse particular suspicion among the investigators. The guy had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was at home then, massaging his mother's feet. It sounds a bit strange, but the fact is that the woman suffered from diabetes, and such procedures helped her fight the complications of the disease. Derek's mother confirmed that her son had not left the house that night and had indeed been taking care of her. But the most important thing was that Derek refuted Quinton's words. He stated that he had not seen Jessica at all that day and had never behaved inappropriately with her. Other mutual acquaintances confirmed this. Even the victim's best friend, Keisha, noted that only Quinton Tellez was in the car with them that day. It seemed that the latter had been caught lying for the first time. The police officers' trust in this guy began to wane. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to return to the starting point of the investigation and continue the search for the possible perpetrator. They conducted interviews with more than 100 young people, including all those named Eric or Derek. But this yielded no results. Meanwhile, public outrage only grew, as most of the interrogated were African Americans. People were already openly accusing the police of bias and racial profiling. The last people the law enforcement officers talked to as part of this case were George and Mentor. Their fingerprints and even saliva samples were taken. Mentor attracted particular attention from investigators because he had communicated with Jessica via messenger just a couple of days before her death. However, after questioning both guys, the police once again reached a dead end. George and Mentor had reliable alibis, confirmed by several witnesses, They denied any involvement in the girl's murder and insisted that they had been friends for many years. Despite all the efforts of law enforcement, the investigation stalled for a whole 2 months. A new lead appeared only when one of the local residents, walking around the neighborhood, accidentally stumbled upon Jessica's cell phone. He immediately handed the find over to the police. Specialists managed to recover data from the device, the last message in the messenger, the call list. It turned out that on the day of the attack, the girl had been texting with an unknown number. That man was openly flirting with her, trying to spark interest in an intimate relationship. But Jessica kept her distance and made it clear that she was not interested in such offers. It later turned out that the persistent admirer was none other than Quinton Tellez, the same one who had previously assured the police that he barely knew the victim and had not said a word about flirting with her. The detectives summoned the guy for another interview. Pressed by the evidence, he eventually admitted to having an intimate relationship with Jessica. Allegedly, they had sex more than once right in her car. However, few believed these revelations. The correspondence indicated that the girl had rejected Quinton's advances, but he continued to insist that on that fatal night, there had been no intimacy between them and that he had not been at the crime scene at all. Investigators visited Tellez's home with a search warrant. In the barn, they found a canister of gasoline. But this was nothing extraordinary. Many car owners keep fuel in stock at home. When asked to show his cell phone, Quinton replied that he had deleted all messages from Jessica as soon as he learned about her death. This explanation seemed extremely suspicious to the cops, but the guy stood his ground impassively. Why would he keep correspondence with a deceased girl with whom he definitely would not have a relationship anymore? Suddenly, Quinton stated that he had an alibi for the time of Jessica's murder. He said that he had just gone to the Fred store, where he had bought a prepaid card for his girlfriend from Louisiana. Allegedly, he wanted to help her with money for a trip to visit him in this way. The police went to that store to check this alibi. Indeed, at 8:26 p.m., Quinton had paid at the checkout. But the place where Jessica's car was set on fire was just a 15-minute drive from there, so the guy could well have made it there to cover his tracks and then returned. Unfortunately, the investigators lacked evidence to prove his involvement in the crime. In a desperate attempt to find clues, the cops took a closer look at Travis Sanford, the victim's official boyfriend, who was serving time in prison at the time of the tragedy. What if he found out about Jessica's probable affair with Quinton and decided to get even with his unfaithful girlfriend through hired criminals? However, this version had to be discarded. Travis physically could not have been involved in the murder of his girl. Moreover, upon learning about her death, he was genuinely distraught and seemed to know nothing about her relationship with Quinton Tellez. The investigation reached a dead end. For 6 months, no new information appeared. Suddenly, one of the police analysts, carefully studying the data from the cell phones of Quinton Tellez and Jessica Chambers, discovered an interesting detail. It turned out that both phones were in the town of Batesville at a certain point on that fateful day, very close to the place where the girl's burnt car with her body was later found. However, by that time, Quinton was already behind bars in Louisiana, serving a sentence for fraud. The investigators visited Tellez in prison again. He readily agreed to talk and confirmed that he had indeed been in Batesville that day. At the same time, he insisted that he had arrived there much later, after the attack on Jessica, and had nothing to do with her death at all. However, during several interrogations, his testimony changed more than once. According to one version, Quinton and his friend allegedly met the girl on the highway, sold her illegal psychotropic substances, I think you understand what I mean, after which they parted ways. Allegedly, all that time, his buddy nicknamed Big Mike was with him. But no one believed this story. It contradicted Jessica's friend's testimony too strikingly. When the detectives visited Big Mike and asked him about Quinton, he did not confirm meeting with him that day. It seemed that the main suspect was lying to the police again, as they had suspected. After Quinton was caught in a lie, he changed his testimony once more. Now the guy claimed that he had indeed been in the car with Jessica and her friend. They had hung out together until about 7 in the evening. Allegedly, they chatted a bit, smoked, and then went their separate ways. Quinton continued to claim that he had nothing to do with the girl's death. Despite his assurances, it was obvious that Quinton was stunned and frightened by how the investigation was progressing. All this only heightened suspicions about him. 14 months had passed since Jessica died. On February 24, 2016, the investigators on this case called a press conference. They announced that they finally had a prime suspect. It turned out to be Quinton Tellez. The detectives said they had collected enough evidence indicating this young man's involvement in the brutal crime against the girl. However, the community reacted to this statement rather skeptically. Many were convinced that the police were simply trying to pin the blame on an innocent African American. The trial of Quinton Tellez began on October 10, 2017, in the town of Batesville. The prosecution spoke first. The prosecutors emphasized that the defendant was the last person to see Jessica alive. The relationship between the young people was complicated. The girl rejected Quinton's advances, while he constantly pestered her. Moreover, there was confirmation that during the car arson, Tellez was near the crime scene. According to the prosecutors, this is what happened. Quinton attacked Jessica and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Deciding that the girl was dead, he tried to get rid of the body and destroy the evidence he staged an arson. To do this, the perpetrator even went home for a canister of gasoline, which he kept in the barn. Upon returning, he doused Jessica and her car with gasoline and set them on fire. But the girl suddenly regained consciousness and managed to get out of the burning car. However, the terrible burns she suffered left her no chance of survival. Quinton's lawyers built their defense relying on the victim's last words. After all, their client's first and last name did not sound like Derek or Eric, which Jessica mentioned before her death. In addition, the defense appealed to the fact that around 8 in the evening, just minutes before the report of the burning car, Tellez was buying a top-up card for his girlfriend from Louisiana at the store. This is confirmed by cash receipts. According to the lawyers, in such a short period of time, their client simply could not physically have made it from the store to the crime scene. Then the prosecutors presented to the court a map compiled based on the data on the movements of Jessica and Quinton's cell phones on the day of the murder. As it turned out, most of the time that day, their locations coincided. However, from 6:49 p.m. to 7:26 p.m., neither of the phones showed any activity. The accusers insisted that it was then, at approximately 7:50 p.m., that the killer went home for gasoline. And then, after making a short stop, he returned to the crime scene again. His mobile phone locator confirms this. It is noteworthy that during all that time, neither Jessica nor Quinton sent each other any messages or called. All this only heightened suspicions about Tellez's involvement in the murder. However, the lawyer insisted that there simply were not enough cell towers in the town for accurate determination of mobile device locations. Means of communication could give incorrect information. These facts were confirmed by an independent expert. Moreover, the surveillance camera recordings never clearly showed Quinton behind the wheel of the car. The license plates also remained indecipherable. The defense also mentioned the message sent from Jessica's phone at 7:43 p.m. In it, Quinton wished the girl good night and wrote that he was looking forward to seeing her the next day. The prosecutors parried that the suspect could have purposely sent these messages to create an alibi for himself. They referred to the testimony of the victim's best friend, who claimed that Quinton had never actually appealed to Jessica. When the arguments of the parties were almost exhausted, the defense attorney made the last move, extremely unpleasant for the prosecution. She drew the jury's attention to signs of racial profiling and bias in the actions of the investigation, since the suspects were mostly African American men. The prosecutors rejected such accusations. According to them, they had confirmation that Quinton had repeatedly tried to achieve intimacy with Jessica, but she refused him every time. The accusers made public their numerous correspondence, where the girl reacted to Tellez's advances very reservedly. Despite this, the defendant himself continued to insist that they did have consensual sex. He even did not hesitate to describe in detail the position and place in the car where he allegedly made love to Jessica. But, of course, this did not prove anything. The prosecution remained adamant. Tellez was lying, and the real picture of that day was as follows. Enraged by the refusal, Quinton attacked the girl right in the car, then took her far from his home and set her on fire there. Unrequited feelings became the motive for this terrible murder. When the jury retired to deliberate on the verdict, they could not reach an agreement. Even after additional time for reflection, the jurors could not definitively either convict or acquit Quinton. Both the second and third attempts to reach unanimity failed, so the court was forced to declare the trial inconclusive. On September 24, 2018, a retrial began. It was largely similar to the previous one, with one exception. This time, the prosecution called as a witness a burn specialist who had examined Jessica's body. The expert confirmed that with such terrible injuries, the girl physically could not have spoken clearly. That's why the rescuers heard some other name instead of Quinton. The prosecutors also provided autopsy results that revealed traces of beatings on the victim's body. According to the prosecution, this indicated a struggle between the victim and the attacker. At the second trial, the prosecution felt much more confident and was determined to obtain a guilty verdict for Tellys. But again, the jury's verdict could not be reached. Meanwhile, Quinton himself calmly lived his life. On August 8, 2015, he even got married. But on that very day, in the city of Monroe, Louisiana, another tragedy occurred: the murder of a 34-year-old student named Ming Jingju. She was found dead with numerous stab wounds in her own home. About 10 days after her death, when the body had already begun to decompose and give off a characteristic stench, forensic experts counted as many as 30 deep stab wounds on it. Obviously, the girl had been killed with particular cruelty. Unraveling this tangle, investigators tracked the victim's banking transactions. It turned out that shortly before her death, Ming had withdrawn a large sum of cash, for which she had purchased a fake prescription for painkillers from some man. She picked up the medicine from the pharmacy, presenting this false document. Ming Jingju drove to the pharmacy in a car driven by a dark-skinned man. After checking the car's numbers, the cops recognized Quinton Tellys in him. Camera recordings captured him a few hours before the girl's murder. And already after her death, someone withdrew over $1,000 from the victim's card. Thanks to the ATM video, it was possible to establish the identity of the criminal. It turned out to be Quinton again. Everything pointed to his involvement in this brutal murder. Tellys was charged with the murder of Ming Jingju and theft of money from a bank card. Unfortunately, in this case, the prosecution lacked evidence against the suspect. The jury found Quinton guilty only of stealing funds, for which he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In November 2022, another trial took place in the Jessica Chambers case. This time, Quinton Tellys was acquitted. The prosecutors failed to convince the jury of his involvement in the brutal crime against the cheerleader. There was not enough evidence for this. So far, the relatives of both murdered girls have not seen justice. Their families refuse to believe in the amazing coincidence that Quinton was nearby every time a murder occurred. Jessica and Ming's loved ones are convinced that Tellys is the real killer. They are disappointed by the system's inability to bring him to justice. In October 2021, Jessica Chambers' mother passed away in the hospital. The cause of her death was never established, but relatives tend to think that the woman simply could not withstand the loss of her daughter and the disappointment in justice. The deaths of two young girls a few years apart left more questions than answers. What do you think about this mysterious and chilling story? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you liked this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. That's all for now. See you next time. Now you see the most notorious serial killer in Canada, who evaded justice for 20 years. He didn't just kill his victims, he fed their remains to pigs. Yes, unfortunately, you heard that right. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, into a dysfunctional teenage family in British Columbia, Canada. His biological parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were too young and immature to raise a child, so they gave Robert up for adoption to a couple from their church, Donald and Linda Pickton, who already had 2 daughters. Robert's adoptive parents were farmers, and he was raised along with his brother David on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a suburb of Vancouver. Leonard Pickton was a strict and reclusive father who rarely showed attention to Robert, and when he did, it was mostly to beat or humiliate him. In contrast, Robert was extremely attached to his mother, Louise, who openly favored him over the other children. Louise Pickton was quite eccentric and untidy. By middle age, all her teeth had rotted due to a complete lack of hygiene, and she had lost her hair, replacing it with a thick beard and mustache. She constantly walked around the farm in a dirty housecoat, loose jeans, and huge rubber boots. However, Robert adored his mother and spent all his free time with her. The Pickton family lived a fairly isolated life on their farm. The farm was cluttered with junk and debris, and the house had an unbearable stench since pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely inside, leaving their excrement everywhere, which no one cleaned up. The Pickton children were forced to feed the pigs twice a day, always covered in manure and stench that they never washed off. This was especially true for Robert, who had a phobia of water and never took a shower. The unsanitary conditions and poverty affected the children's social lives. At school, Robert was constantly bullied for his peculiar smell and lack of hygiene. He also significantly lagged in his studies, attending only special needs classes. Eventually, at 15, Robert was expelled from school for distributing pornographic magazines. This only pleased his mother, who now had a permanent helper on the farm. Robert's brother, David, although growing up in the same conditions, managed to adapt better. He had more friends, dated girls, and even occasionally took showers. However, from the age of 16, David had trouble with the law. In 1967, he hit a 14-year-old boy, Tim Barrett, with a truck, causing serious injuries. Instead of calling an ambulance, David fled the scene. His parents, upon learning about this, decided to cover up the crime. Leonard immediately started cleaning the blood and repairing the truck, while Louise threw the injured boy's semi-conscious body into a roadside ditch where he soon drowned. Louise later confessed this episode to a friend. Despite a thriving farming and meat business, the Picktons continued to live like beggars. They constantly scavenged dumpsters for food and junk, which they brought home. Leonard always smelled of manure and even took pride in his nickname, Piggy. The most traumatic experience of Robert Pickton's childhood happened when he was 12. The boy went to a livestock auction and bought a cute calf for $35, which he had earned himself to raise on the farm. For several weeks, Robert cared for and pampered his pet until one day, after coming home from school, he didn't find it in the barn. Horrified, Robert saw the calf hanging by its legs from the ceiling, slaughtered. Behind him, a quiet laugh sounded. It was Leonard Pickton, who decided to cruelly prank his son. This event deeply traumatized Robert's psyche. In his youth, Robert's responsibilities on the farm only grew. When the family moved to a new farm in Coquitlam, Robert and David fed the pigs 3 times a day, after school and on weekends. During this time, Robert found a job as a butcher's assistant and gained skills in slaughtering and butchering animals. Meanwhile, David worked in house demolition. The death of their parents in 1978 to 1979 made the Pickton brothers the official owners of the family farm and a multi-million-dollar business. Each of them, including their sister Linda, received a substantial inheritance. However, Robert's share was limited by additional conditions, possibly due to his parents understanding his instability. With the farm in their possession, the Pickton brothers somewhat expanded their activities. The farm became a junkyard for old cars and scrap metal. Robert actively developed his meat business, buying animals at auctions and slaughtering them for the locals. The farm gradually became a gathering place for various criminal elements who hung out there, unaware of the grim secrets of its owner. Overall, Robert Pickton's childhood and youth were marked by numerous psychological traumas due to the lack of parental love and upbringing, as well as the horrible living conditions. As an adult, Robert continued to live as a recluse in the poverty and unsanitary conditions he was accustomed to from childhood. Only the job as a butcher gave him some satisfaction, but later, he would channel his love for violence and blood into the most terrifying direction, specifically into a neighborhood known as East Side. East Side, or Low Track, as it is more commonly known by locals and the police, is the poorest and most destitute area not only in Vancouver or British Columbia, but in all of Canada. This urban wasteland, consisting of a dozen blocks filled with cheap hotels, pawn shops, and ruins, contrasts sharply with Vancouver's image as one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the world. Low Track earned its nickname, Dollar and Vein, Pain and Vanity, from its main artery, the intersection of Main and Hastings. This area has the highest concentration of drug-dependent people in the city, with official data reporting between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. Strong psychotropic substances supplied by Latin American gangs and Asian triads are the most popular among the local residents. The majority of drug-dependent women in Low Track earn their living through prostitution and live on the streets around the clock. Their appearance is so horrifying that one reporter aptly described it as the result of a crack diet. Safe sex is unheard of here, hence Low Track has the highest HIV infection rate in North America. According to a 1995 survey, 73% of East Side women started prostituting themselves as children. The same percentage were unmarried mothers with an average of 3 children, 90% of whom were lost to social services intervention. Less than half knew where their children were. Notably, over 80% of Low Track sex workers were born outside of Vancouver and ended up here in search of a better life. The history of East Side is a chronicle of endless human tragedies. Initially, the neighborhood was flooded with homeless and unemployed people who flocked to Vancouver hoping to get rich at Expo 86. Around the same time, cartels flooded the area with cheap drugs, breaking the lives of an entire generation. Religious communities, in an attempt to beautify their streets, drove sex workers into this very cesspool. The final blow to Low Track was dealt in the 1990s. Federal welfare cuts in 1994 left many without means of subsistence, and psychiatric hospitals dumped their patients onto the streets. By 1997, rampant promiscuity and drug addiction caused an HIV epidemic, infecting 1 in 4 residents of the neighborhood. Government needle exchange programs, distributing up to 3 million units annually, failed to stop the epidemic. By the way, what do you know about this neighborhood? In 1998, an average of 1 person died daily from an overdose in East Side. But it turned out that drugs weren't the only threat to the destitute here. A few years before Expo 86, the first disappearance of a woman from Low Track occurred, which the police ignored. It wasn't until 14 years later, when the number of missing women numbered in the dozens, that attention was finally paid. Prostitutes are a very elusive category of victims. Usually, they are runaway girls who constantly change names and addresses, hiding from everyone. So when they disappear, it's hard to determine if it was voluntary or forced. Investigators had little chance of tracking the fate of individual women. However, over time, a sinister pattern emerged in the disappearances of low-track prostitutes. One of the first to disappear was Rebecca Guno on June 22, 1983. But most victims were reported missing only months or even years later. For instance, Teresa Williams, who disappeared in July 1988, was reported missing in March 1989. Kathleen Watley, last seen in June 1992, was searched for only at the end of the month. During this time, the perpetrator only intensified his activities, shortening the intervals between abductions. From August 1997 to October 1998, 6 more women disappeared. It was during this period that Robert William Pickton, a 48-year-old failed farmer from Port Coquitlam, appeared on the police radar. Almost all the missing women were seen in the company of this reclusive man who constantly roamed East Hastings in search of cheap women and drugs. Pickton was well known in local brothels and drug dens and readily bought services and goods without bargaining. According to eyewitnesses, Pickton lured prostitutes with promises of drugs, money, and shelter on his farm. Many fell for his tales of a better life away from Low Track. Getting into Pickton's smelly van, the poor souls had no idea they were heading to their own funerals. Since 1980, Pickton regularly visited a waste processing plant where he disposed of animal remains from his farm. This place was located a block from East Hastings, making it easy for the farmer to combine his legitimate business with his gruesome hunting of women. According to a police task force report from 1998, in just the last 3 months, Pickton had taken at least 4 women from East Side. Another 4 women had dropped off his radar because they either died of overdoses or escaped from the terrifying death factory. However, the police discovered the existing victims too late. Thus, thanks to a fatal combination of circumstances, the authorities' indifference, the imperfections of the laws, and the murderer's cynicism, East Side became Pickton's ideal hunting ground for many years. Low Track supplied the maniac with new victims, and he turned them into missing persons and fed their remains to his pigs. It wasn't until the persistence of certain detectives and the relatives of the deceased forced the police to at least start investigating the series of mysterious disappearances that had swept the scariest neighborhood in Vancouver. In the mid-1990s, brothers Robert and Dave Pickton began hosting loud parties on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. These large gatherings, known as Piggy Palace, attracted hundreds of people and became a popular entertainment venue not only for local criminals, but also for ordinary residents and even off-duty police officers. The Piggy Palace was officially registered as an entertainment business. It had security, bartenders, live music, and a spacious dance floor. On successful nights, the Pickton brothers earned between $10,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars per party. These profits, along with their meat and pig farming business, allowed Robert and Dave to significantly increase their wealth. Robert Pickton, with years of experience as a butcher and meat cutter, was responsible for slaughtering livestock on the farm. He bought animals, often sick and covered in ulcers, at low prices at auctions. The animals were then slaughtered and hung by their legs. Afterward, Robert butchered the carcasses, and the meat was sold to customers or stored in refrigerated rooms. Animal remains unsuitable for human consumption were taken by Robert to a waste disposal plant in Vancouver. This facility was located a few blocks from East Side, the poorest and most crime-ridden area of the city, known for its brothels, drug dens, and high concentration of homeless people. Starting in 1995, the number of missing persons in this area skyrocketed. Although the victims' acquaintances repeatedly reported to the police, the authorities did not show much concern for the fate of marginalized women. Meanwhile, Robert, like his brother Dave, led an active social life. He frequently visited local bars and met women, some of whom even lived with him in a trailer on the farm. During one such cohabitation with a woman named Tanya Carr between 1992 and 1995, Robert temporarily suspended his criminal activities. But this lull did not last long. Once Tanya left, he resumed hunting for victims. One time in 1995, Robert brought a woman named Tracy, a sex worker from East Side, to the farm. In his trailer, filled with women's clothes and jewelry, Robert tried to force Tracy to look for his wallet and then threatened her with a knife. Eventually, he let the frightened woman go, driving her back to the city. On the way, Robert boasted that he was a white knight who saved bad women and gave them a second chance. At the same time, he threatened to kill those he couldn't fix. Tracy was lucky to survive this terrifying encounter. However, other victims of Robert Pickton were not so fortunate. In 1995, near the farm, an unidentified woman's skull was found, sawed in half and showing signs of long-term storage in a freezer. An autopsy revealed that the skull was cut with the skills of a professional butcher. Despite this, Robert Pickton remained out of suspicion for a long time, and his criminal activities gained momentum. The killer's brutality increased, the number of victims grew, but the police did not take decisive action. Parties at Piggy Palace continued to bring the Picktons huge profits, which no one paid attention to. The lack of oversight from the authorities allowed the farm to become a den of debauchery and crime. Even explicit hints of Robert's involvement in the disappearances of homeless women, voiced by his former lover Lisa Wells, did not prompt immediate police action. Only in the early 2000s, when the number of missing women from East Side reached dozens, did the police finally begin a thorough investigation. By that time, Robert Pickton had become one of the most terrifying serial killers in Canadian history. In the early 1990s, Vancouver police began receiving increasing reports of women going missing in the East Side area. Most of these women were involved in the sex industry and led marginalized lives, complicating the investigation of their disappearances. Often, relatives and friends of the missing did not immediately report to the police, and when they did, they encountered a skeptical attitude from the authorities. The police did not see a connection between the numerous disappearances for a long time and did not give them proper attention. Such women often moved from place to place, changed names, and disappeared for a while, so their disappearances were not seen as something extraordinary. Police inaction allowed the criminal to continue his activities with impunity. It wasn't until 1998 that an official search for the missing women began in Vancouver. This happened after concerned citizens handed the police a list of over 30 women who had disappeared without a trace on the streets of East Side in previous years. However, even then, the police were reluctant to take on the case. The initial check of the list revealed nothing suspicious. Some of the missing were found alive in other cities. Others died of diseases or overdoses. It seemed there was no cause for concern. The case only moved forward thanks to Detective Dave Dixon, who decided to dig deeper. He personally reviewed all the missing prostitute reports and compiled a new list of 16 women. All of them were last seen in the East Side area, starting from 1995. Such a number of disappearances in a relatively short period could not be a simple coincidence. Dixon managed to create a special task force to investigate these cases. Despite the obvious similarity of the disappearances, even within the task force, not everyone was convinced there was a connection between them. Some police officers believed the women might have voluntarily left the city in search of a better life. Theories were proposed about their possible departure to other cities or even countries. There was a lack of facts that unequivocally pointed to criminal activity. The situation began to change when news of the investigation leaked to the press, causing a public outcry. Journalists began their own investigations, interviewing acquaintances and relatives of the missing, drawing public attention to the issue. Under pressure from the media and public activists, the police had to step up their efforts, especially after human remains were found on the outskirts of the city in the fall of 1998. This forced investigators to consider the possibility of a serial killer operating in Vancouver. A large-scale investigation began. All possible leads were checked, and potential suspects were followed. The Vancouver police received assistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The number of missing women cases investigated by the task force reached 31. An unprecedented search operation was launched. However, the investigation's success was limited. The investigation lacked experience in such cases, as Canada had not previously faced crimes of this scale. There were no bodies, crime scenes, or physical evidence for a long time. Only fragmented testimonies from acquaintances of the missing women, which often contradicted each other. The lack of information generated numerous rumors and speculations, which only hindered the investigation. Some progress occurred at the end of 1998 when task force detectives received information from Bill Hiscox, a man who had worked on Robert Pickton's pig farm. Hiscox reported that strange things were happening on the farm. Prostitutes were often brought there, suspicious people constantly roamed around, and most importantly, women he had seen with Pickton later disappeared without a trace. Hiscox claimed he saw items belonging to the missing women on the farm and was convinced Pickton was involved in their disappearances. This information forced the task force to focus on Robert Pickton. It turned out he had a history of violent incidents. In 1997, Pickton was accused of attacking a woman he nearly stabbed on his farm, but the case was mysteriously dropped. Other women also complained about Pickton's violent behavior, his passion for sadism, and his strange sexual habits. All this made him highly suspicious. However, there was still insufficient evidence to arrest Pickton. Detectives put Pickton and his farm under covert surveillance, hoping to capture something incriminating. But Pickton, if he was the killer, was very cautious. He seemed to sense he was being watched and gave away nothing. Moreover, some influential people among his acquaintances stood up for Pickton, so detectives were advised not to rush to conclusions. The investigation hit a dead end. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. In 1999 to 2001, another 20 women went missing from the ill-fated East Side, and all this happened against the backdrop of loud parties that Pickton continued to hold on his farm, ignoring the authorities' interest in him. The police admitted their efforts were still in vain. They could only hope that if a serial killer existed, he would eventually make a mistake that would lead the investigation to him. But years passed, the number of victims grew, and the long-awaited mistake did not happen. It was only in early 2002, after more than 4 years of unsuccessful investigation, that an event finally occurred that gave the police a chance to expose the criminal and end his atrocities. This event was a search of Robert Pickton's farm, which revealed the horrifying truth hidden behind the walls of Piggy Palace. The findings in Pickton's possession shocked even seasoned police officers. On February 6, 2002, the police finally dared to search Robert Pickton's property. The formal pretext was Pickton's possession of unregistered weapons, but in reality, the investigators hoped to find evidence linking him to the disappearances of women from East Side. On that day, dozens of law enforcement officers flooded the farm in Port Coquitlam, owned by Robert and his brother David. Robert Pickton and his brother were arrested for illegal possession of firearms, allowing the police to obtain a warrant for further searches of the premises. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. All over the farm, which more resembled a junkyard, were scattered personal belongings of the missing women, their clothes, jewelry, and documents. And in Pickton's refrigerators, human remains were found, later identified as parts of his victims' bodies. The most horrifying sight was the barn Pickton used for slaughtering and butchering bodies. Dried blood and human hair were found on the meat hooks, and under the floor, teeth and bone fragments were discovered. Along the walls stood barrels filled with a foul-smelling liquid containing decomposing human remains, which Pickton used to feed his pigs. It was a gruesome scene. One of the officers involved in the search later recounted, "The stench of decay was so unbearable you could hardly breathe. It felt like we were in hell on earth. I had seen dismembered bodies before, but what we found at Pickton's was beyond description. It was like being in a horror movie." The farm was literally filled with evidence of horrific crimes. In piles of trash, criminologists found sawed bones, teeth, and strands of hair. In the freezers were limbs wrapped in plastic bags, and buried in the backyard, barrels were full of partially decomposed remains. To examine all these gruesome finds, a whole army of experts worked on Pickton's farm. For months, they sifted through tons of soil and debris, searching for the smallest fragments of evidence. Overall, the search lasted almost 2 years. During this time, remains of 48 women were found on the 6.8-hectare property, although only 27 could be definitively identified. During the searches, it was revealed that Pickton liked to photograph and videotape his victims in various stages of dismemberment. Hundreds of horrifying photos and recordings were found on the farm. Some showed Pickton posing next to severed heads or mutilated bodies. He seemed to take pride in his horrific deeds and kept these trophies as mementos. Witness testimonies gathered during the investigation complemented the picture of Pickton's atrocities. For example, sex worker Lynn Ellingson, who attended his parties, said she saw a woman hanging on a meat hook in the barn with her skin peeled off. Another witness, Bill Hiscox, who worked for Pickton, confessed he had often seen him lure women from East Side to his trailer, only for them to disappear without a trace. During interrogations, Robert Pickton mostly remained silent or proclaimed his innocence. But in one video recording played in court, he confessed to a friend that he killed prostitutes and fed their remains to pigs. The best way to get rid of a body is to give it to pigs. They eat it quickly, along with the bones and everything else, Pickton's voice was heard on the tape. As it turned out, Pickton lured his victims to the farm with promises of drugs and money for sex. There, he drugged the women and then attacked them. Some he strangled to death, others he killed with a sledgehammer or hammer. Afterward, he dismembered the bodies in the barn using a chainsaw and knives. The remains were thrown into acid barrels or used as pig feed. Some body parts he scattered throughout Vancouver, discarding them in dumpsters or landfills. The more details of the investigation came to light, the greater the shock to Canadian society. People could not believe that a maniacal killer could operate for so long in a civilized country, destroying dozens of homeless women. Many blamed the police for negligence and bias, as the disappearances of East Side prostitutes had been known since the 1980s. But the authorities ignored the problem for years. It was only when the number of Pickton's victims reached staggering proportions that the police finally recognized the serial nature of the crimes and launched a large-scale investigation. But even after the first searches of Pickton's farm, several months passed before he was finally arrested for the murders. In the meantime, he likely managed to destroy many pieces of evidence. On February 22, 22, Robert Pickton finally ended up behind bars. He was charged with the murder of 27 women, whose names were identified from the remains found on his farm. But the real number of victims of this monster, according to law enforcement estimates, could reach 49 or more. At the time of his arrest, Pickton had a reputation as a quiet and friendly farmer who sometimes sold meat. None of his neighbors had any idea about the horrifying secret of Piggy Palace. The trial of Robert Pickton, which began in 2007, became one of the most high-profile and extensive in Canadian history. He was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder committed between 1995 and 2001. Most of his victims were prostitutes, drug addicts, or homeless women from the troubled East Side neighborhood. On the defendant's bench, Pickton behaved calmly and showed no remorse. The jury took 10 months to review all the evidence and hear 128 witnesses in the case. In their verdict, they found Pickton guilty of the second-degree murder of 6 women, whose remains were found on his property. The court decided not to consider the remaining 20 cases, fearing the trial would be prolonged. On December 11, 2007, the judge sentenced Robert Pickton to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Mr. Pickton sowed death on an unprecedented scale. He disregarded human life and exploited vulnerable women to satisfy his perverted desires. Neither remorse nor humanity stopped him, the judge said during the verdict. For the relatives of the deceased women, this sentence was a moral victory but did not bring relief. Many of them never received official recognition of the death of their loved ones, whose remains could not be identified. Others accused the Canadian justice system of leniency, as Pickton effectively received the minimum punishment for his atrocities. The case of Robert Pickton left more questions than answers. Why did the police ignore the disappearances of homeless women for so long? Did the killer act alone, or did he have accomplices? How many victims actually died at his hands? Unfortunately, we may never know the whole truth. Pickton never repented and remained silent until the end of his days. The investigation into the disappearances of women in Vancouver's East Side was accompanied by numerous shortcomings that significantly complicated the search for the criminal and the arrest of serial killer Robert Pickton. One of the main reasons was the Vancouver Police's rejection of the new method of geographic profiling developed by Inspector Kim Rossmo. Kim Rossmo, the creator of the geographic profiling method, noted the unusual concentration of disappearances in East Side as early as May 1999. His method involved mapping unsolved crimes and identifying patterns or signatures of criminals that might be overlooked by detectives assigned to individual cases. However, the Vancouver police dismissed his insights and rejected the possibility that the missing women could be victims of a serial killer. Instead, the police claimed that the women might have voluntarily left Vancouver in search of better living conditions. Refusal to work according to Rossmo's method led to his demotion, and he was forced to resign. He was simply told, "You don't understand anything, and your methods are childish." This internal conflict only worsened the situation. The police were left without concrete evidence of a crime for a long time due to the absence of bodies or crime scenes, significantly complicating the collection of forensic evidence. Furthermore, Canada's violent crime tracking system did not monitor missing persons without specific evidence of a crime, further complicating the search. Problems also lay in the reluctance of pimps and sex workers to cooperate with the police due to fear of possible arrests. Resources were limited despite growing media attention to the case. Several suspects, such as Michael Leopold and Barry Thomas Niedermeyer, were considered, but none were found guilty of the women's disappearances. Evidence was insufficient, and the police focused on a few suspects, leading to wasted time and resources. A key moment in the investigation came when Bill Hiscox, who worked on the Pickton brothers' pig farm, reported that women visiting the farm disappeared without a trace. Despite his testimony and suspicions, the police did not pay due attention for a long time. It wasn't until 2002, when the police issued a warrant to search the Picton's farm for suspected illegal firearms, that evidence linking Pickton to the missing women was found. The impact of rejecting the new profiling method and investigation shortcomings led to many tragedies. The Vancouver police spent years searching for the criminal, during which dozens more women went missing. Delays and insufficient resources allowed Pickton to continue his crimes. The refusal to work with Rosmo's methodology, which could have helped find patterns in the disappearances faster, led to lost lives and immense suffering for the victims' families. The shortcomings of the investigation and rejection of new methods underscore the importance of effective coordination and use of modern technologies in criminal investigations. Refusal to cooperate with profilers and insufficient resources can have catastrophic consequences, as happened in the Robert Pickton case. This story should serve as an important lesson for law enforcement worldwide. Have you ever immersed yourself in the world of fantasies? There are people who delve so deeply into their own dreams that the line between the imaginary and the real blurs for them. Usually, this doesn't affect those around them, as the dreamer simply lives in their own imaginary world. But what happens if such a fantasizer tries to drag someone else into their illusions? This story demonstrates just how dangerous such situations can be. Morgan Ashley Fox was born on August 22, 1991, in the small town of Canton, Ohio, which had a population of about 70,000. From a young age, she was an obedient and calm child, a diligent student, and a loving daughter. Morgan had many friends and easily got along with any group. She was popular among her peers at school. As a teenager, she started dating a boy, and shortly after graduation, she found out she was pregnant. The young couple in love was over the moon with happiness. They had a daughter, whom they named Amelia. Due to her early pregnancy, Morgan did not go to college. Instead, she got a job as an operations manager at FedEx Delivery Service. It was here, during one of her shifts, that she met and befriended a colleague named Jason Allen McDermott. The young man was only 4 months older than his new friend. He spent most of his free time on the internet and was passionate about video games. Gradually, co-workers began to notice that Jason was literally obsessed with Morgan. He brought her food and drinks during every lunch break and constantly talked about her to his friends and acquaintances. All of this gave the impression that there was something more than just friendship and communication between the young people. In fact, his behavior resembled an obsessive infatuation that alarmed some of his colleagues. The guy found Morgan's social media pages and started following her posts. He even installed a special app to monitor her activity confidentially. At times, Jason secretly recorded videos of the girl. Despite his fascination, he behaved in a friendly manner and didn't bother Morgan to the point of causing her displeasure. In August 2020, Morgan brought her friend Mary to the company for training, and Mary ended up under Jason's supervision. The girl immediately noticed how often and how much he talked about Morgan. It was so intrusive that Mary suspected something was off and advised Jason to stop and cease tracking her friend. She wanted the guy to stop monitoring Morgan's social media pages and gradually distance himself from her in order to cope with his obsession. Mary knew about similar cases of stalking and understood that it could all end badly. Unfortunately, the secret admirer ignored this advice. Despite Mary's warnings, he constantly admired Morgan's beautiful hair, talked about her daughter, and everything related to the object of his desire. Jason clearly sought to develop a relationship and started with friendship. Now he had a new obsessive idea to ask Morgan out. He completely ignored the fact that the girl was already in a serious relationship, preparing for a wedding, and everything was going well with her fiancé. In June 2020, Morgan moved into a new house on Fraser Avenue with her fiancé and daughter Amelia. To celebrate the housewarming and her birthday, Our story's heroine decided to throw a party, inviting friends, relatives, and co-workers, including Jason. At that time, she considered him just a friend and was unaware of his obsession. For Jason, however, this invitation was another sign that Morgan was hiding her feelings for him. He had repeatedly shared his ideas about getting closer to the girl with other employees, but most doubted his plan would succeed. Of course, he ignored these warnings, as his own fantasies convinced him of the need to confess to his beloved. Jason decided to use the party to finally stop being just a friend and become Morgan's boyfriend. During the celebration, Jason acted as if he were a member of Morgan's family. When the girl was showing the guests around her new apartment, the secret admirer was scurrying about, helping to prepare for the party, serving food himself, and even chatting with Morgan's grandmother as if she were his relative. Overall, he was friendly and nice, but such behavior seemed somewhat odd. Some of those present tried to figure out who this young man was and whether he had a relationship with Morgan, but the girl denied any romantic involvement, calling Jason just a good friend and colleague. This probably greatly saddened the guy, as he never dared to confess his feelings, fearing rejection. Later, an incident occurred that seriously damaged their friendly relationship. On October 8, 2020, Morgan briefly left her mobile phone unattended at work. Jason, knowing the password he had previously peeked at, took this opportunity to learn even more about his beloved. On her device, he unexpectedly discovered intimate photos of Morgan and, being delighted, even showed them to other guys from the office. Upon returning to her workplace, the girl quickly realized that someone had used her phone and viewed the explicit pictures. This made her very angry. The obvious suspect was Jason, who was constantly hanging around her desk. Colleagues hinted to Morgan to pay attention to 3 young men who were discussing something near her place during lunch. They immediately gave up Jason. The furious Morgan accused him of violating her privacy. At first, the guy denied everything, but under pressure, he confessed. The girl was enraged, ceased communication, and blocked the secret admirer on social media. Finally, her eyes were opened to his unhealthy obsession and stalking. She heard from colleagues about his frank conversations and infatuation with her, which caused concern. Morgan knew about stalkers and was afraid of becoming a victim of one. Therefore, she completely cut off contact with Jason and even told colleagues about her desire to change jobs. Obviously, Morgan's reaction was not taken calmly by Jason, although he understood his guilt. He assured the girl that he had only viewed her intimate photos but had not downloaded or shared them, although it later turned out to be untrue. However, Morgan was adamant in her decision to stay away from him. Meanwhile, Jason asked colleagues to help him restore communication with the girl. He wrote her a long letter of apology, which several acquaintances signed. In this message, the guy begged for forgiveness and asked to be unblocked on social media. Through the mediation of colleagues, he continued to bombard Morgan with messages and tried to call her, but was rejected every time. Jason's friends and co-workers noticed changes in his behavior and appearance literally the day after Morgan brushed him off. He became disheveled, unkempt, and ignored remarks from the department manager. It was evident that due to the quarrel and obsession, Jason was barely sleeping and looked bad. Moreover, during lunch breaks, it became noticeable that he had stopped eating properly. Despite everything, the young man still cherished the hope of restoring a relationship with his colleague, with whom he was obsessed. On October 24, 2020, Morgan was visiting relatives in Columbus, Ohio. Jason sent her a short message asking how she got to her family. The girl was shocked, as she had told almost no one about this trip. She realized that Jason was still following her. When she asked him how he knew about her being in another city, there was no response. This brief dialogue was the last documented communication between our story's heroine and her stalker. On October 28, 2020, the day passed at home with family, her fiancé and daughter for 29-year-old Morgan Fox. She was preparing to go to work for the night shift, which started at 2:30. The child's father walked his beloved to the door, kissed her goodbye, and they parted ways. He went to bed, and she headed to the car. When the man woke up around 6 a.m. to get ready for work, he made himself coffee as usual and looked out the window. What he saw instantly alarmed him. Morgan's car was still in the driveway, and moreover, it was parked in such a way that it could not be fully seen. This seemed strange, as his fiancée's work shift had not yet ended. Troubled by what he saw, the guy decided to go outside and examine the car with his own eyes to find out what had happened. On the way, he grabbed his mobile phone and tried to call Morgan. But at the very moment he crossed the threshold and opened the front door, he heard the sound of her phone ringing. The fiancé ran to the car and saw a terrible sight. The driver's side door was open, and in the seat was his beloved covered in blood and showing no signs of life. She did not respond to the calls of her mobile phone, which lay at her feet on the ground and was ringing incessantly. Stunned by what he saw, the frightened young man immediately called 911 emergency services. A team of paramedics along with the police arrived at the scene in just a few minutes. They officially declared 29-year-old Morgan Fox dead, the cause of which left no doubt 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Apparently, the victim had just managed to get behind the wheel when she was attacked. Her feet were still on the ground, while her body was already in the car seat. Characteristic signs of rigor mortis had already appeared on the body, by which the time of death was determined quite accurately around 2 o'clock in the morning. The girl died instantly and without suffering, after the very first fatal shot to the head. Unfortunately, there were no video surveillance cameras installed in the area of the house where the couple lived. Also, no spent casings were found at the crime scene. Neither the neighbors nor the victim's fiancé heard any gunshots or noise from an unfamiliar vehicle. None of them noticed anything suspicious that night. Nevertheless, the investigators managed to find tire tracks on the asphalt that were obviously left in a hurry. It appears the attacker fired 2 shots, probably from a pistol equipped with a silencer, and then quickly disappeared from the crime scene in a car. This was clearly evidenced by the nature of the traces on the road surface. Clumps of earth and dirt were even torn out from under the wheels. However, despite this, none of the local residents heard anything suspicious. The deceased fiancée and her friends told investigators about one intrusive young man who had been behaving strangely for a long time and was clearly very interested in Morgan. Of course, they were talking about Jason, her co-worker, with whom the girl's relationship had seriously deteriorated shortly before the tragedy. Many considered him the most likely suspect in Morgan's murder. The police decided to check his alibi and found out that he had arrived at his night shift at 2:59 a.m., where he stayed until about 10 a.m., after which he went home. Theoretically, the guy had the opportunity to commit the crime, as his alibi was not confirmed at 2 a.m., but the time window turned out to be quite narrow, which only increased suspicions about him. Many people described Jason's strange relationship with Morgan, who, in her naivety, allowed him to get too close to her. People said that she allowed this man too much, recalling at least his behavior during the party at her house, where he felt like the host. Ultimately, it all resulted in a clear violation of privacy and an intrusion into the girl's personal life, because of which she completely ceased communication with this colleague. Investigators were well aware of this model of behavior, and stalkers refusing to communicate often becomes a motive for them to attack. The most interesting information for the police was the serious changes in the young man's behavior that occurred immediately after Morgan brushed him off. He became sloppy and was clearly struggling with some psychological problems. But interestingly, after the murder, Jason specifically went to a car wash after work and thoroughly cleaned his blue Ford inside and out, even though it was raining outside, so there was no particular point in washing the car. In general, this did not fit with his careless attitude towards his own appearance lately, which his colleagues had talked about. According to them, he did not care about his appearance, let alone his car. Moreover, according to their testimony, the car was in good condition and clearly did not need maintenance. An examination of his vehicle yielded no results. Nothing was found inside. Of course, the investigators treated this information with suspicion. First of all, they checked the only available evidence: the tire tracks left in the mud in front of the victim's driveway. It seemed that the tread prints were identical to the tires of Jason's car. Moreover, such a tread pattern was quite rare. Undoubtedly, this automatically made him the prime suspect in the murder. New testimony quickly emerged that confirmed the detectives' suspicions. In search of evidence, the police reviewed the recordings from all the surveillance cameras that could have captured the perpetrator's route. In the footage, they managed to spot a car similar to Jason's when it stopped at one of the intersections near Morgan's house. The recording was made at 1:38 a.m., after which the car headed towards the home of his future victim. It was captured on cameras a second time around 2:17 a.m., when it was returning the same way. Assuming the perpetrator acted quickly, he could well have fit into the allotted time frame. When investigators learned about Jason's intrusive behavior, they decided to thoroughly examine his electronic devices. Thanks to this, the detectives were able to prove that the suspect was gathering information about the girl, secretly monitoring her activity on social networks. This allowed him to find out almost everything about her: where she lived, what her daily routine was, which made it possible to plan the attack in such a way as to remain unnoticed. To the investigator's surprise, the suspect's phone was not detected in the area of the victim's home at the time of her murder. All this time, the device was at Jason's house. The guy explained this by saying that he had forgotten his mobile phone and worked the whole shift without it. For the same reason, he allegedly could not find out why the object of his obsession did not show up for work. However, this did not exclude the possibility that he deliberately left the phone at home to avoid tracking his whereabouts and divert suspicion from himself. The perpetrator turned out to be quite cunning and cautious, which seriously complicated the investigation. On November 1, Jason published a post on his social media page in memory of Morgan, in which he wrote, "You were a bright light in my life and the lives of many other people. You were always there when I needed you. I would like to list everything about how you influenced my life, but the list would be so long that we would never reach the end. You were a friend if I had a bad day. I knew that I could always come and talk to you." Jason continued, "It's so strange that you are no longer around. It has left a huge hole in my heart. But I know that you will always watch over us, your family, your friends, and your daughter. You have made an unforgettable impact on the lives of all of us, and you will never be forgotten." This post ended with the hashtag #JusticeForMorgan. 3 days after the crime, Jason went to the Walmart store with his friend Mickey. There he continued to talk about Morgan, who is no longer among the living. From Jason's words, it followed that he had an intimate relationship with the deceased girl, and now these memories would remain the only recollection of her, which he intended to cherish for the rest of his life. 4 more days after the massacre, he again found himself in the company of his buddy Mickey. This time, his colleagues went to say goodbye to the victim of the attack. Though Jason behaved strangely again, he asked several people about exactly how the video cameras that record traffic on the roads work. He was interested in whether they record continuously or only take short videos when sensors detect speeding. But he never got an answer to his question. During a meeting with the mother of the deceased at the funeral, Jason continued to surprise with his behavior. He told the woman a story about how he once gave her daughter a stuffed toy, and now he insistently asked to return this gift, claiming that it would be a good reminder of what a wonderful person Morgan was. The young man was so persistent that he almost broke into the mother of the victim's car, begging her to give him the toy. The woman even had to raise her voice to finally get him off her back with this request. Fortunately, the evidence gathered against Jason in the form of surveillance camera footage and tire tread marks was sufficient for his arrest. On November 4, 2020, he was detained on suspicion of committing the murder, and later charged with premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances and stalking with threats. After the arrest of the victim's former friend, the police carefully examined his hands. In the case of using a firearm, traces of gunpowder gases can remain on the skin for a long time, and they are not always washed off even during a shower. Therefore, there was a possibility that even a few days after the crime, these traces could still be detected. Forensic experts conducted a thorough analysis, but no powder residue was found on Jason's body. His clothing, which he was wearing on the night of the attack, was also checked, but no traces of gunpowder gases were found on it either. This fact was actively used by the suspect's lawyer, trying to prove the absence of direct evidence and the clear contradiction of the facts with the version of the investigation. The trial in the case was scheduled for April 2, 2021. Oddly enough, several witnesses from the immediate circle of both the victim and Jason himself considered the murder charge against him to be erroneous. The defense argued that the police relied only on indirect evidence, while there was no direct evidence of the young man's involvement in the girl's death. Many friends and relatives described him as a calm and non-aggressive person. Despite his obvious obsession with his colleague, none of them could believe that Jason was capable of such a thing. And indeed, the prosecution's arguments were based solely on indirect evidence. The detectives immediately dismissed the versions of robbery or sexual assault. Firstly, the victim was not missing anything, including valuables in the car and her purse. Secondly, no signs of sexual violence were found either. It was a quiet, peaceful area where no gangs operated, so Morgan could hardly have become an accidental victim of some criminal showdown. The nature of the tire tread marks found at the crime scene matched those of the defendant's car. Moreover, the attacker clearly tried to make it so that his car remained unnoticed by the victim. He could have lurked in ambush, waiting for the right moment. According to the prosecutors, the defendant wanted Morgan not to see his vehicle until it was too late, and she did not have time to call for help. One of the key questions in the case was the murder weapon, which was never found. It was known that Jason owned a firearm. He had a Ruger .22 caliber revolver, which law enforcement seized for inspection. The victim was shot with a similar weapon, but after a ballistic examination, it became clear that this particular revolver was not the instrument of the crime. The investigation never managed to find the very pistol from which the fatal shots were fired. However, this did not exclude the possibility that Jason could have illegally purchased another pistol with a silencer, killed the girl, and then disposed of the weapon. In addition, the prosecution focused on the suspect's strange behavior, in particular on the fact that he thoroughly washed his car, probably immediately after the attack, and this despite the fact that it was raining outside. The young man tried to explain his actions by the presence of mental problems and symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. However, experts did not confirm the presence of such disorders or depressive states in him. He was indeed depressed because Morgan stopped communicating with him, and against this background, he had recently behaved, on the contrary, untidily. Anyway, taken together, these facts looked extremely suspicious. When the defendant was asked why he was in the area of the victim's home shortly before her murder, he denied the very fact of his presence there. However, there was no exact geolocation data to confirm the police's words, since his phone remained at home, and the GPS module in the car was turned off. The only evidence that he was there was the recordings from the surveillance cameras, but the defense argued that the footage simply captured a similar car, because due to the poor quality of the night shooting, it was impossible to see the license plates. As for washing the car, Jason additionally explained this by saying that he was allegedly going to go to his mother to give her a birthday present, so he decided to wash the car beforehand. However, as it turned out, the holiday itself took place back in June, 4 months before that, so on the part of the son, it looked like an obvious delay. Naturally, the court regarded his words as untrue. Numerous witnesses at the trial spoke about the defendant's obsessive behavior towards Morgan. He clearly tried to cross boundaries and pretend to be a much closer person than he actually was. The girl did not take his behavior seriously, which allowed him to get so close to her and even cherish illusions about a possible shared future. Jason did indeed manage to become a close friend of Morgan's, right up until he violated her privacy by looking at the explicit photos. This happened just 20 days before the massacre, after which the young man desperately tried to restore their communication. But all his efforts were in vain. It was probably this that pushed him to such radical actions. After all, he was the only one with a real motive for murder. On the night of the murder, colleagues noticed striking changes in Jason's behavior at work. He looked much more cheerful than in previous days. When asked what had happened, the guy said that Morgan had supposedly resumed communication with him and even added him as a friend on social media, so he hoped that she had given him another chance. However, employees doubted the truthfulness of his words, because before that they had communicated with Morgan and knew about her unwavering position regarding Jason. The girl was determined not only to ignore her former friend, but also intended to change jobs. She admitted that she had allowed this guy too much, because of which she lost control of the situation. It was obvious that there could never be anything between them. That same night, Jason showed his colleagues a photograph in which he and Morgan were pictured together in the office. He considered this picture a wonderful friendly gift. At the same time, the guy himself expressed concern that the girl did not show up for work. To all the questions of his colleagues, he answered that he had no idea where Morgan could be since he had left his mobile phone at home. Later, when everyone learned about the girl's death, his actions began to seem even stranger. Jason's behavior changed again. He became more agitated and repeatedly expressed concern that GPS data from his car could be the reason for being held liable. He confessed to his colleagues that he was passing through the area where Morgan lived on his way to work on the night shift, but then changed his story and began to claim that the GPS device in his car could have been hacked and someone was trying to frame him. Then Jason told his co-workers that the day after the murder, his car was allegedly stolen but quickly returned. After that, the suspect insisted that the GPS module in the car was definitely hacked, but avoided explaining what exactly caused such doubts. Later, detectives found out that Jason had created a fake social media page, which he used to spread a fictional story about his intimate relationship with Morgan. He described in detail what allegedly happened between them and even used explicit photos of the girl from her phone as confirmation of his words. This activity began back in June 2020 and, according to the prosecution, could have been an attempt to create an alibi. In these conversations, the suspect told several women the same story on behalf of Morgan, the same one that he retold to his friend Mickey while walking around the store. It seems he was trying to spread information about intimacy with the victim, probably to divert suspicion from himself. The .22 caliber cartridges, which fit the weapon with which Morgan was shot, were indeed found in the defendant's house. However, he claimed that he kept these ammunition for his father's revolver, which was given to him as a means of self-defense. Due to the absence of casings at the crime scene, the ballistic examination could not definitively establish from which weapon the shots were fired. At the same time, such a number of coincidences looked extremely suspicious and became another indirect evidence of the young man's guilt. Jason's close friend came to his defense. According to his buddy, the defendant never showed aggression or anger towards Morgan. Although he was obsessed with the girl, he would never harm her. According to the friend, Jason was extremely upset that Morgan had blocked him on social media and refused to communicate. He was very worried about this, lost his appetite and sleep. But according to the confession of a close friend, Jason blamed only himself for everything and understood that he had done wrong. He did not feel rage towards the girl and was not going to take revenge on her. So he clearly could not be the perpetrator of this murder. The defendant himself insisted that under no circumstances could he have done this to Morgan. He admitted that he had the most tender feelings for her and was ready to let her go if it was impossible to build a relationship. Jason considered his obsessive behavior a manifestation of strong feelings that his friend never managed to appreciate. The lawyers emphasized the fact that Morgan Fox was an attractive girl and had many admirers. In their opinion, from the very beginning of the investigation, the police focused only on Jason and actually did not consider other possible suspects. They say the goal of the detectives was to prove Jason's guilt and not to find the real culprit. However, despite the persuasiveness of the defense's arguments, the prosecution insisted that it had done all the necessary work, during which no other obsessed admirers of Morgan were identified, except for Jason. The deceased's fiancée also underwent a thorough check. No traces of gunpowder gases were found on his hands, which were examined immediately after the tragedy. There were no bloodstains on his clothes. He successfully passed a polygraph test. In fact, as the prosecution claimed, Jason was a skilled manipulator who had been hiding behind the mask of a friend for years. The defendant turned out to be a pathological liar who managed to deceive everyone around him. But everything's secret became apparent when he lost control of his feelings for the victim. Then it became clear that in reality, he was a self-centered and extremely jealous type. And after the phone incident, the girl decided to completely sever all ties with him. Jason harbored a grudge and decided to take revenge. He simply could not come to terms with the fact that Morgan would be with someone else. This idea was also confirmed by the behavior of the defendant himself, and he clearly cherished illusions about a relationship with the victim and passed off the desired as real, which is typical for people of this type. Despite all the efforts of the investigation, the young man turned out to be surprisingly well prepared. Throughout the entire investigation, forensic experts never managed to find the murder weapon, bullet casings, any fingerprints, DNA traces, or personal belongings that Jason could have left at the crime scene. He even managed to skillfully hide his exact whereabouts, despite the fact that modern technology is literally packed with tracking tools. All this put the prosecution in an extremely disadvantageous position. They had to convince the jury and prove the suspect's guilt, relying only on indirect evidence and assumptions. The only physical evidence that was obtained was the tread marks identical to those on the wheels of the defendant's car. The prosecution tried to prove that a typical stalker appeared before the jury, who acted exactly as people of his type usually do in such situations. He really pursued Morgan, which was confirmed by numerous correspondence and testimony of colleagues. But could he really go so far as to kill the one he loved so much? On April 2, 2021, the jury retired to the deliberation room to discuss the verdict. In the end, Jason was found guilty of murder with aggravating circumstances, as well as stalking. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole, as well as an additional 180 days in prison for stalking. Jason never admitted his guilt, and his lawyer insisted on a review of the sentence, but none of the appeals were granted. Live, dream, but don't lose your head, dear friends. Leave likes, write comments. I wish you all the best and see you next time.